It was early spring. The wind was bending the trees down. Everything was flooded with water. It was getting dark, and it was raining nonstop. An overturned carriage lay on the ground. The windows were broken. The door was open. Someone was able to get out. Blood was visible. The girl with violet eyes was lying on the ground. The rain was dripping on her. Her hair was scattered and covered in dirt. The villainous Gabriella, with drops of blood, looked without blinking. An abrasion and scratches on her face led to her death. She died on a rainy day in early spring. A young man approached her, called her, squinted her eyes at him, but never said a word. She just looked with her violet eyes. He asked a question that remained unanswered. The rain wet him, and the water ran down his face, flowed down his sharp chin, and dripped down. He asked her to live. He wants this, even if they are not together. So the guy pretended that he didn't know anything. He lifted her by the neck, sat down, and the young man held her carefully in his hands. His tears were hidden by the rain, as if he had not cried. It was all the fault of the rain. "I wish the sun would shine today," he continued. But the girl's lifeless hand had already fallen. He clenched his teeth, asked questions that were unanswered, looked at the lady, frowning. If it were sunny, then his face would not seem so sad, she thought, looking with her lifeless violet eyes. Ernst Chaos, the one who controls the forces of the night, the leader who guides his loyal army. And this black-haired man was the husband of the holy villainous Gabriella. Hand in hand, they walked to the altar to get engaged. It all started with the short story March in the Name of a True Saint, when the phone fell onto an open book. The girl found herself in the body of the villain Gabriella. As soon as she realized this, she began desperate attempts to remember the plot, looked at herself in the mirror, and did not see her face. An illegitimate daughter is born to the Count and lives like an angel, but in the real story she only accused and tormented and met her death. The heroine screamed, put her fist to the mirror, leaned her forehead on the cold glass, really wanted to live. The scream got stuck in her throat. She closed her eyes, mentally screamed, and fought like a caught bird. She didn't want to die. While the girl was standing near the mirror, reading before her rebirth, an announcement from the author of the novel suddenly popped up in her head. The hand lingered on the mirror. If we are talking about a cold man from the north, then the girl knew who we were talking about. Apparently, he was the main character of the next story, she assumed. Everything can change. The story is not over yet, because being the main character is not so bad. But can she be happy in the body of a villain? The girl wondered. I thought so before, but now something changed. When the guy held her body in his hands, something changed. A man approached and reported that they had detained the escaped coachman. A pale-faced man looked at him. The young man led the man with his hands tied. He admitted that he had deliberately damaged the carriage wheel. The coachman lowered his eyes down and did not look at the gentleman. On his back, he had the banner of the power of the day. The girl lay in the arms of the young man, with her eyes open, blood pooling in the corner of her lips. Ernst gritted his teeth, thought that the first prince was behind this, but he wasn't sure, just a guess. He took the girl in his arms, turned around to leave, without looking back. He said as he went what needed to be done with this person. First, cut off his hands. He turned around. If this doesn't help, then his legs should be cut off so that for the rest of his days he can only crawl. The guy said coldly, without showing any emotions. Gabriella's lifeless eyes watched him. She saw him like this for the first time. He seemed frightening to her. The Duke had always been kind to her, even though the marriage was fictitious, she remembered. It was impossible for these two to truly fall in love. They only had to play at love for 3 years. The girl was worried a lot, because her feelings were sincere. She was afraid to reveal them. Ernst held the girl tightly to him, tenderly calling her his wife. The day was sad with them, shedding his tears. Gabriella could not think that she would die, but she saved the family heirloom, which the guy presented to her as a wedding gift. When the carriage stopped and the coachman extended his hands to the girl, she was very frightened and had no choice but to hide the ring. A valuable family treasure that is not afraid of fire, Gabriella could not allow it to go to the royal family. The lady grabbed Ernst with her hand, tried to tell him about the relic, stopped her. There is no need to say anything now. There is no need to waste your energy. The man gently convinced. She raised her head, looked, and began to talk about the ring, but she didn't have enough strength, so she fell silent. The young man looked at her with pain in his eyes. His whole body was burning. He needed to take care of the girl's health. She exhaled, barely whispered, squeezing the fabric on her husband's camisole with her hand. She didn't want to leave such terrible memories. She thanked them for coming and not leaving her to die alone. The husband looked at his wife dying in his arms without blinking. The bitterness of loss was reflected in his eyes. No words were needed to express the loss. Without giving up hope, he carried away the girl's body. Her last thoughts were that she hoped for their meeting in the next life. A loud male voice was heard. He addressed the lady, clarifying whether she was listening or not. She sharply opened her green eyes, not understanding what was happening and how she got here. Straightened up, the girl sat on a marble chair, her folded hands nervously ruffling the fabric of her dress skirt. She saw people, but did not understand why she was here, because death had taken her into her kingdom. She looked more closely and saw that the ruler of the large hall was here. The forces of day and the forces of night gathered in one place. This surprised the lady. Friendship had finally been achieved, she thought. Today, the marriage between the Duke and the princess is officially concluded. In 3 days, they will go north. The girl turned her head. There was a question in her eyes. The man was talking about her husband, Ernst, the lady understood, surprised that a marriage was taking place between him and the princess. An unbearable pain pierced her heart. She put her hands to her head. How did she scream so much? She was about to tear herself apart in her chest. All family members pointed and shouted at her, whispered that she was a disgrace to their family, a blot on the rays of the noble sun, and called her a raving princess. The pink-haired girl, about whom there were many rumors, was Princess Fiona Isodium. Embarrassed, she raised her hand to her chest. She couldn't believe that she had become this princess. How was this possible in her head? The man clasped his hands in a prayer gesture. If there are no revivals, then it is necessary to sign, the man continued, not noticing the torment of our heroine. Mr. Ernst also needs to sign the contract. The man sat with a dark face opposite the princess and was not in the best mood. The character looked at the young man without taking his eyes off him. It seemed that he became even colder and gloomier than he was. Looking down, the young man read the marriage contract, clenched his hand into a fist, raised the pen and signed, without looking up at the girl. The princess was in no hurry to sign, clenched her fists, thought. The priest hurried her, indicating with his hand that she needed to sign. Before her eyes appeared a sheet on which there was a marriage vow, dated today. Taking the pen in her hand, she was going to sign. Finally, the pen waved in her hand. The character signed, looked at the date, and calculated that 6 years had passed since the death of the villainess Gabriella. And exactly 6 years later, she became his wife again. The man closed his eyes. He was not happy about his marriage. Fiona looked with her mouth slightly open. She knew, only now the Duke hates her, because this time she is the royal daughter. The girl was sitting at the table, thinking about opening up, telling the young man that she was his Gabriella. Her cheeks turned red. Before her death, the heroine prayed to meet him, and here she is, sitting in front of the guy and looking with green eyes. She is still the same, only in a different body. Having made up her mind, the princess opened her mouth to shout the truth to the man. Not a word came out. It was strange, but she couldn't say it. Then Fiona decided to write, but her hand with the pen was shaking, and blots were dripping onto the paper, and she couldn't do that either. She covered her face with her hands. She would now have to live in this body. The problem was that the princess was the enemy of her husband. The kingdom was divided into 2 powers. The power of the day, it is the prosperous South, loyal to the royal family. They love art, culture, and horse riding. The power of the night, they also love art, culture, and horse riding, if only for one thing. They are spread throughout the desert north, united and act according to the orders of the Grand Duke. The 2 forces have different lifestyles, and there is no reason for marriage, Fiona thought. The girl was already in the room. She turned to look at the dress, in which she would spend 3 days after leaving the palace. She walked closer to her beautiful wedding dress. It was actually a good deal. The king insisted on the 2 forces joining together. She put her hand to the rhinestones. The deal was good, especially for the north. She breathed out the name of a person dear to her, the leader. The heroine saw the man's face for the first time after separation, but his expression was terribly cold and did not express any emotion. She lowered her head. The girl was silent. When she watched the Duke at the signing ceremony, she saw that the guy was not happy about this marriage. She became sad. She must already forget her wife Gabriella. She won't remember her forever, she thought, holding her hand on her dress. She closed her eyes, frowned. This is not the time for sadness. The heroine cheered herself up. The guy was cold to Fiona for another reason. The girl remembered that Ernst hates the entire royal family, so she is the reason for the hatred. She leaned her foreheads against the mannequin. She was very sorry, but she felt joy from their meeting. Even if the man had no joy from this marriage, she admitted to herself that she was selfish. Experiences began to torment her. The man often forgot to eat because of work, the girl remembered. It was good that the servants were nearby. She missed Ernst very much and was distracted from her thoughts by the maid, who jerked open the door and shouted her presence. Fiona turned to her, looked without saying a word. The maid ran in and twisted her head, as if looking for something. She stood in front of her, put her hands on her hips, began to command. She needs to stand up straight, because the girl has lost weight. She needs to take measurements again and sew in the dress. The maid was indignant. Her green eyes narrowed. She was angry. How dare the servants talk to her like that? Fiona thought, frowning. She knew the story. Everyone bullied the girl, even the maids. They didn't pay attention since childhood. She looked down at the maid. Her green eyes flashed. When the princess was sleeping in her bed, the girl's consciousness gradually penetrated into her. This continued for a week, and very soon it completely penetrated into her, although her body was always in the bed. No one showed any concern. She was a disgrace. The heroine knew who started the very first rumor about Fiona, one of the brothers laying claim to the throne. The girl survived because no one needed her, and her brother, in his stupidity, thought that he would kill her at any moment. If she wants to survive, she put her hand to her chest. Where the beads of the dress were, she needs to play the fool. A light smile touched the girl's lips. She had a cunning plan, but she needed to be careful. Holding the bow on her chest, she asked the maid what was so special about the dress that she was worried about it more than about her life. The girl smiled, and the maid, not noticing anything was wrong, continued to adjust the dress. She turned to the girl, said that the maid would die within an hour, got scared, she recoiled, and began to babble incomprehensibly. She touched the beads with her fingers and thought the maid was very arrogant. The pearls represent the holiday in honor of the bride's departure, but the maid replaced them. Fiona smiled, looking at the girl. If the truth is revealed, then death awaits her. She watched the reaction. The maid jumped up, backed away, screamed, put out her hand that it wasn't her. She didn't know at all whether the pearls were real. The girl laughed loudly, spread her arms to the sides, and ordered her to tie up her dress so that she would become even more beautiful. The maid bent over, her shoulders trembled. She lowered her head, and unable to raise it, her hands clenched her uniform, and in a slurred tongue she asked who knew all this. Putting her hand under her cheek, Fiona began to wonder who she could tell, the maids, so that they would be jealous, or the king, teasing the girl. The maid's mouth twisted in a scream. She raised her hand to her chest. It wasn't her doing, it wasn't her fault. The heroine put her hands to her face and assumed that other maids had stolen her pearls, but the girl just screamed. Putting her hand to her lips, she thought that even if she tore out her tongue, she wouldn't even be able to blame it on the other maids. After all, she was an accomplice. Fiona had already been used this way many times. They knew that even if another pearl noticed, she still wouldn't have time to do anything. She clapped her hands and decided to ask for an opinion about her brother's appearance. The skirts of the dress rustled, holding her with her hand. The girl went out. Her brother would say that she was beautiful even without pearls. The maid screamed, stood in front of the princess, waved her arms at her. She wanted so badly to stop her. She put her hand to her chest. The maid promised to return the pearls to her. The frightened girl shouted about it. There is still time. She folded her arms across her chest. The heroine looked down at the maid, clarified that they had already been sold, and doubted that they would be able to return everything. She pointed her finger to the floor and gave the order to get on her knees. The maid was confused. She waved her hand. The girl did not obey, so she decided to intimidate her and go to her brother, tell her that she would get married without pearls. They shared it with the rest of the maids, and he would also warn about this. Our heroine achieved what she wanted. The girl fell to her knees, asking the lady to give her another chance. She reproached her about her high chin. Then the maid lowered her head, lay down on the floor, begged Fiona for mercy, and blamed her greed. Putting her hands under her chin, she smiled sweetly at her. There will be mercy. But now the girl has become her debtor. She will be her accompaniment, she decisively stated. The maid had a choice of prison or loyalty. She chose the second, extended her fist, and swore her loyalty to her. Having learned the girl's name, she reached out her hand and ruffled her hair. Now Sonia serves Lady Fiona. Bright red flowers are collected in a bouquet of revenge. This is a gift to the princess for her body. A couple of days later, the wind developed the flags of the House of the Power of the Night. Leaves from the trees fell to the ground. A detachment was preparing to set off to accompany His Highness. On this day, the brother saw his sister off. The servants also came out. Ernst and Fiona stood next to the carriage, saying goodbye to the man. The fair-haired guy, first Prince Tudwig, pressed his hand to his chest. His heart sank at the thought that he would have to part with his sister, but his eyes betrayed something completely different. He closed his eyes, flashed a dazzling smile. No need to worry, the royal guards will escort them to the port, the prince allowed. The girl's behavior changed. She acted out a scene in front of her brother that she was joyful and pleased with such a blessing. But in fact, inside, she felt disgust. He opened his eyes, smiled. The girl saw only greed on his face. Although the rest of the court ladies really liked him and considered him an attractive young man, Tudwig was a greedy person who had a hand in everything in the world. He used tricks and stole sacred relics of other families. And it was he, the first prince, who had a hand in the death of Ern's wife, the villain Gabriella. She closed her eyes, tried to calm down. She needed to behave like Fiona, not give in to emotions, took a breath, exhaled. But Lady Cass's consciousness was still simmering. It's unfortunate that Tudwig could not accompany his beloved sister, the man continued, but extended his hand. The third brother would see her off. They were like blood, after all, he summed it up. He pointed his hand at the guy standing next to him. He turned his head away from the girl. He never loved her, the heroine thought. Johann, the same third prince, did not look at his sister. He was forced to accompany her, since he never received a place in the royal court. He was a year older than Fiona. The girl wondered how long he would last in their lands. Tudwig turned to his sister, giving her parting words before the journey, so that she would send news and not forget about her family. Finally, the heroine waited for this. The prince revealed himself, raised his hands to his cheeks, began to smile, shouting words of joy, and that she would do everything, accidentally talking about himself in the third person. She nodded her head so that beads of sweat appeared. She heard from the man that she was smart, but she herself thought that it was disgusting and did not share his views. It was this man who taught little Fiona how to talk, he suggested, to talk about herself in the third person. Memories of the body suddenly appeared to the girl. She shuddered, was covered in goosebumps, wrapped her arms around herself. Her husband looked askance at her and looked at her with a question. She was uncomfortable talking about herself in the third person in public. She would rather drown herself, but she had to hold on. She was up to something, folded her hands, looked innocently at her brother, and wanted to thank her brother. The man's eyebrows shot up. He was surprised and did not understand what the girl wanted to do. Fiona grabbed her husband's sleeve, pressed herself close, and laughed, grateful that she never thought she would marry such an attractive man. And also she twirled around, holding her skirts with her hands. She had a very beautiful dress, specifically showing pearls. The girl smiled. The ladies whispered, hiding behind their fans. They saw that the pearls on the dress were not real. Real pearls shimmered in the light. The first prince darkened his face, because he had to spend a fortune on this dress. Rumors spread at breakneck speed. The man felt awkward, blushed, promised everyone to take care of his sister, made noodles. It was heard to him. She looked at everyone present with her big green eyes. Not only she should be ashamed, she did everything right. Only 2 princes came out to see her off. She was curious where the second prince was. While they were saying goodbye, the whole court was watching them. But it was for the better. His absence before, Fiona always trembled when the second prince was nearby. This body only remembers fears. She looked attentively at Ernst. It seemed to her that he looked at her and immediately frowned. Tudwig called the butler to him, reprimanded him about the pearls. He leaned over. His frightened face turned pale. The servant whispered that he checked everything. It seemed to him that this was the work of the maids, since a substitution had already happened in the palace. Fiona, meanwhile, continued to play her game, approached the maid, hugged her shoulders, asked permission to take her with her. No one else liked her. The girl smiled. He generously gave a wedding gift to his sister, who squealed with joy. He came closer to his sister, smiling, and warned that if her husband bothered him, let him send a message. No one noticed anything. Farewell to brother and sister. He put his hand on her shoulder. Her hand trembled. A bright light spilled out from under it, which burned the girl's skin. She screamed. It hurt. Through clenched teeth, she trembled, but she tried to endure it. It was necessary. She needed to smile and not show her weakness. It was just a game, and the scene was not over yet. He tore the prince out of his grasp. Ernst pushed the girl behind him and apologized to His Highness. Now he himself will take care of his wife, he said loudly enough for the whole yard to hear. He turned to look at the people. They were getting into the carriage. It was time for them to hit the road. Fiona looked without taking her eyes off. Admiring exclamations about the man were heard. He extended his hand to the girl. He, like no one else, acted according to manners. Everything she remembered about the guy was only good. He did not show his concern for others. But by this, he showed that he would treat Fiona with respect. A bright blush colored the girl's cheeks. Her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. She could not cope with her emotions. It became difficult to breathe after my death. I could not even imagine that I would ever meet him again. She frowned. These few days seemed like a mirage. The heroine never expected that she would become Ern's wife again. Seeing that she cried and turned away, the man touched, trying to find out what was wrong with her. For the first time, anxiety appeared on his face. Having climbed into the carriage, the guy leaned on the window, gave the order to the servant that it was time to hit the road, took a comfortable position, and waited for departure. He had more than one carriage, but he decided to go with it in order to protect the weak princess. And now he looked through the window at his reflection, remained silent, and made sure that the girl had not fallen into the trap of her older brother. The carriage started moving, the coachman controlled the reins, the heroine rejoiced, she was able to leave here. The first prince watched them go, but Fiona slipped out of his clutches and the entire kingdom. The princess looked at these people who were familiar to Fiona, but not to the character. She was returning to the lands dear to her heart. Seeing her reflection in the glass, the girl shuddered. Each time she was surprised, as if for the first time. She touched a strand of hair. She could not get used to her new face. She peered into herself, examined her face. She touched her lips with her hand, and the heroine saw cat eyes, rounded eyebrows, smooth porcelain skin, and rosy cheeks. She was 23 years old. She touched her cheek. She liked the girl. She was beautiful, like early autumn days. Without noticing anyone, she was absorbed in her appearance. She nodded her head. She needed to get used to the fact that it was now her face. She lowered her head and thought. The problem was this body. You need to act innocent. Gabriella was a villain. She acted like it. The girl was curious. Several questions arose about who killed Gabriella on that dark day. The character was sure that Ernst had already found out, and lost in her thoughts, assumed that this was the first prince. He is trying to win the battle for the throne. He is very interested in treasures and artifacts. His goal was stones. He could easily plan her murder. Another question tormented the girl about what she was doing in the future, when she could end up in the past, not yet in her body. She could have gotten there with her knowledge. She longed for a connection with her husband. She could have. I remembered the moment when she swallowed the ring, the same one that her husband presented. She thought, raised her hand to her mouth. She would need to find out everything as soon as she returned to the palace. It would also be interesting to know where Fiona herself, the owner of this body, was, the lady thought, moving her eyes around the carriage. But this is not the most important task. She just needs to give the ring to Ernst. They will live happily ever after this time. She tried to convince herself first. She looked at the silent man. He stubbornly pretended to be busy with the landscape outside the window, and the girl really wanted to sit next to her and talk. But she couldn't just tell Ernst that she was Gabriella. It was bitter. She put her hand to her throat so that not a word would come out. She removed her hand, squeezed it, looked at the man. The blush did not go away. He was so close. But at the same time, so far away, Fiona sighed heavily. Ernst didn't even look in her direction, and it hurt. She turned away from him, looked at the top. Leaves were falling from there, and watched them in fascination. She closed her eyes. The cool wind pleasantly caressed the girl's skin, as if she had returned to that day again. Smooth waves hew the seacoast. Every step leaves traces on the wet sand. They were together. That day she confessed her feelings to him. The guy buried himself in his shoulder and didn't respond to her confession. He just looked at her. She became sad. She fell silent. There was only peace and quiet between them, and Gabriella's eyes expressed love. She missed those days. I wanted to get rid of the magical shackles and tell my husband everything, but as soon as I broached the topic, I couldn't utter a word. She got hooked on the word fetters, said it several times, tasted the word. She had heard it somewhere before, but she couldn't remember. She screamed, bowed her head. A guess pierced her whole body. This couldn't be happening, but she understood what had happened. The girl remembered that she had already read about this. In that same book, the main character Ingrid was also struck by a spell. The red-haired lady's surprise knew no bounds. The hooded man confirmed her guesses by pointing to the book. Her role was sent down by God. Each hero has his own purpose. The secretive person confessed. If he fulfills it within a certain time, the shackles will be removed. The girl frowned. She needed to tell her everything in more detail. She was ready to listen. The young man turned around and handed the book to the girl. His words were not so difficult. He could even show it if necessary. She touched the book, looked at it, holding it in her hands, and was in no hurry to open it. The guy carefully watched the lady with his red eyes that sparkled from under the hood. It was a book of characters. The girl unfolded it, began to leaf through it and type it in with her finger, reading what was important to herself. Her finger stopped on the right line. She saw an exception. This is what she was looking for. The young man in the robe pointed to the character, Ingrid Weibel. A long-term spiritual spell was cast on her. The girl stared at the recording. In order to remove this spell, you need to play your role. The lady opened her eyes and darkened her face. She slammed the book, lowered her hand, stared blankly at the guy, waiting for some kind of explanation. Red eyes flashed. The man under the hood warned her, if she failed, the spell would not be lifted, as if thunder had rumbled. She put her hand to her forehead, laughed. Her cheeks acquired a reddish tint, and stared again at the man, smiling openly. She saw him pulling his hood over his face and asked when this crazy god would remove his shackles. No one knows the answer to the question, but it should happen soon. He turned to her, showing his face. A light blush appeared on the guy's cheeks and invited her to join him. Her hands were holding the phone. All the phrases of the characters were there. After reading and exclaiming, just like that, our heroine read everything in the book. She clenched her hands into fists, gathered the fabric of her dress to remove the shackles, tell her husband that she was Gabriella. She needed to play this character for a while. The heroine was a villain who pretended to be cute. That's why she got into Fiona's body and raised her hands up. Oddly enough, but the princess was suitable for revealing Gabriella's character. From a long time ago, she was thin, pretended to be weak, cried a lot, and pretended that she was an angel, pretended to be innocent, clenched her fists tightly. She clasped her hands, pursed her lips decisively, accepted herself as such, and will act. She needs to do it, and she is ready. The girl's look became crazy. She decided that she would smile sweetly and say what was expected of her, tolerate any surprises, easily act out her innocence, play her character perfectly, and free herself from the shackles. She closed her eyes and covered herself with her hair. In fact, the girl really missed her husband and friends. She raised her head, the wind shook her hair and flowed over her shoulders. She actually loves urns. This is the kind of plot that this story needs. The man watched the silent torment of the lady, saw how she clenched her fists, and glanced out the window. My eyes widened when I heard Ernst talk about going on a trip for a couple of days. Upon arrival, the lady will be allocated the right wing, and the young man will continue to live there with her maids. Fiona was upset, lowered her eyes, realized that the man was very cold towards her. This made her sad. Nothing worked out on the first try, and there was no need to be nice, the heroine thought. The guy closed his eyes. The girl was appraising him. He had always been like this, but now his gaze and voice had become deeper and more serious during this time. Ernst noticed the princess's searching gaze, narrowed his eyes. Something was wrong with his face, since she was looking at him so intently. The girl laughed wildly, raised her hand, closed her eyes, nodded her head, said that everything was fine, and a cute blush appeared on her cheeks. I thought about what to say to the man, I decided. I put my hand under my chin, laughing. I asked him a question, because my husband is now so cold. It suddenly became uncomfortable in the carriage. Dark waves came from Ernst. Fiona became embarrassed. She would bury herself. This time the guy didn't remain silent, lowered his head, and exhaled that she did it on purpose then. The heroine remembered how she twirled in the courtyard in front of everyone with her skirt, showing off her pearls in front of her brother and retinue. She opened her eyes, pretended to be cute, raised her finger to her mouth, but she couldn't admit that she did it on purpose. Ernst answered, looking at the girl, that he shouldn't have done this. He married Fiona, considering her not a very smart lady. The heroine understood that if someone was smarter, more savvy, or posed a threat to the north, the man would not have married, so she would continue to play the fool. The girl admitted that the dress was uncomfortable. The man was surprised by this, and at first he couldn't even say anything. To be honest, Ernst didn't think about it. It turns out her dress is too tight, he clarified with her. They could stop and call the maids to help the girl take off her dress, but she exclaimed, refusing the help of the servants. This is not what Fiona wanted. She stood up and leaned on her hands, enclosing the man in the ring of her arms. Leaned close, too. Her breath fanned the guy. She was stunned by such behavior. She said seductively, maybe her husband himself will help unlace the corset, pressing closer to him. He won't sit idle. She pursed her lips. Her face darkened. For a minute she wanted to do this. He would recognize her if the girl looked like Gabriella. She turned around to return to her place, without turning her head, and agreed. Let him call the maids. She sat down, hiding her hands behind her, lowered her eyes to the side. It's normal that Ernst doesn't recognize her. She was blinded by rumors and gossip, but he doesn't know. The girl remembered the East Wing, a building for annoying guests, a beautiful place, but located too far from the main building. They won't live as a couple. Their hands clenched on the bow of their dress. They celebrated their engagement earlier in the north, the man said, explaining to her. She couldn't just go into this annex, so she would quietly leave, but then they would recognize her. Her hands squeezed the bow tighter. Anger filled the character. She would do anything for the man to recognize her. The detachment set up camp. Large tents stood in a clearing, and the main tent was surrounded by guards. Ernst was sitting at the table, reading a letter, leaning on his hand, when he was distracted from this matter by a shout. Raising his head, but not removing his hand. Everything went well, the man clarified, looking at the newcomer. The chief assistant commander, Sebastian Dessen, smiled with a happy smile, clenched his fist and raised it up, confirmed. Ernst rose from the table. The assistant continued. The cargo was delivered by the rest of the squad and placed on the ship. The man closed his eyes, relaxed, praised him for his excellent work, and was pleased with it. The transportation was partially needed to resolve a military issue, but mainly necessary for civilians, those who witnessed the overthrow of the first prince. This was the original plan from the moment of marriage. Only the closest ones, the elite and Sebastian, were privy to this mission. He raised the cup, took a sip, closed his eyes, and finally found a way to get rid of the prince. He coughed, spitting out the tea, and turned to Sebastian, saying that he had never learned to cook, covering his mouth with his hand. The guy laughed, bringing the teapot, narrowed his eyes with pleasure, and replied that it was still better than the lady. Suddenly, becoming serious, he reminded her that the anniversary of her death was coming soon, and she would be pleased if the commander left a gift at the grave. The lowered head of the chief spoke of reflection. He dabbed his mouth with a napkin and stopped Sebastian's attempts. He collapsed on his chair and hissed in warning at the laughing guy to watch his words. He told the assistant in the back that the princess had helped them a lot, and they needed to express gratitude to her, since I was sure that everything was in order. The guy leaned his elbows on the table, resting his hand. It was difficult for him to accept this, although he understood everything perfectly well. Sebastian turned sharply, narrowed his eyes. The commander himself knows how much they respected his wife. The lenses of his glasses flashed. Ernst lowered his head, blushed from such words, nodded his head. He knew everything perfectly, and the assistant continued talking about the princess. She will not harm the north. This issue has been studied carefully. The young man clenched his hands into fists. He was not going to look for a wife after Gabriella's death, although he felt sorry for Fiona, whom the first prince mocked. Not having studied the norms of behavior in society, she was like a child. The prince approved of the girl because she was not smart. She was needed for revenge. But now he will protect her like a younger sister until the end of his days. But the commander could not believe that she was, as rumors say, prone to sleepwalking and madness. They were torn from the conversation by a man who reported an important event. A battle began, and he shouted. Ernst jumped up, but Sebastian calmed him down, let him sort out the papers here and rest, but he needed to go. As he left, he recalled his first wedding night. The prince froze. Even 10 years later, he felt uneasy that someone had become his wife again. He was very tired. His strength was leaving him. He ran his hand over his face. A drop of sweat rolled down his cheek and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be a difficult day. The man understood this. He wanted to close his eyes and rest. A fire was quietly burning on the street. Silence. The night took over this place. Ernst sat down on the edge of the sofa, rubbing the bridge of his nose, melancholy taking over his heart, remembering his Gabriella. She would be disappointed in him if she found out that he married for revenge. He used the princess. He was bitter about it. Just to be closer to the first prince, he got the opportunity to move freely through the territories of the forces of the day. He touched his hair, looked up with his blue eyes. He had other excuses. He couldn't find words to express his emotions. 6 years is a long time, but every time the young man closes his eyes, he thinks about his wife, remembers the smile, the skin pale from the cold. Soft body, warm, will never see him again. Closed his eyes, squeezed his eyes shut. The loss is too great. Ernst blamed himself. The guilt lay like a heavy stone for not being able to save, not being able to protect his wife. The pain was terrible. He rushed over as soon as he read her letter, but he couldn't do anything. Every detail of her death was remembered. Thoughts about it plunged the man into despair. Now every rainy day he visits the place of death. I remembered what kind of rain it was that day, the deserted land, and the scarlet bright blood was imprinted in my memory forever. The cold body, her last breath. Ernst promised that everyone who was guilty or involved in her death would be punished, lose their heads, and clenched his hand into a fist. Fiona quietly entered, holding the curtain, saw a man who was immersed in his thoughts, cleared his throat, and apologized for his intrusion. She loudly called his name, putting her hand to her chest, looked with her huge eyes, and did not know what the guy was thinking about. A couple of minutes ago, a fire was crackling on the street. Tents were set up, sparks flew up and to the sides, giving warmth. Fiona looked down with a sad look. There was no romance on her wedding night. She realized that the man did this on purpose, because otherwise he would have had to stay in the same room with her. She, of course, was very flattered that Ernst rejected all women. She did not know what to do in this situation. The girl was completely upset, cry or laugh. I looked from the carriage, saw a maid sitting near the fire and chewing a pie, and called out to her. She rose sharply, straightened up, clenched her hands into fists, ready to listen. Saphira did not know where the Duke was, but she promised to find out, turned around and quickly rushed somewhere. The skirts of her dress fluttered from fast walking. Fiona liked her agility. She sank into the seat. Not that she didn't want unwavering loyalty, but she saw that the maid wanted to be on good terms with her, aware that the princess had saved a life. And now the girl stood there, smiling happily. She managed to get to the man and offered to make him some delicious tea. The young man was not happy with Fiona's invasion. His face darkened. The lady saw it, but was not afraid. She would not leave here so easily. He told the girl that she shouldn't bother. She got upset, stopped laughing, and looked at her with a different look. I saw cups of tea behind the man and realized that things were really bad since Sebastian had made the tea. Fiona argued, because she knew for sure that the guy loved tea, so she wanted to make it. She bombarded him with questions so that she could make tea and drink it, but the man remained unshakable. He found excuses. Then the girl decided to press for pity, and almost with tears in her eyes began to talk about how everyone hated her outside. And the attack with his eyes worked. The guy allowed him to drink tea, but then immediately went to bed so that the lady could go, turning away from her when she spread her arms out in joy. The fragrant tea was ready. The heroine poured it into cups, carefully holding the lid of the teapot, steam rising. Ernst was on the other side of the table, but even from there he noticed that the girl knew about tea. He noticed back when there was a story with pearls. Fiona did not see the guy's tormenting thoughts. She enjoyed the tea ceremony, and the prince's thoughts were about the attitude of the house towards the princess if she makes tea herself. He was not so much curious, but interested in how an unsmart girl could make tea so skillfully. In addition, he drew a parallel. A warm, familiar feeling arose in his chest when he saw how elegantly he handled tea utensils. He stared without looking away. There were no manifestations of any emotion on his face, but the guy was confused. She was just about to touch the mug on the saucer with aromatic tea when they took it away and moved it in her direction, a young man. He picked it up, wanting to take a sip of tea. Because the girl was trying so hard, he lowered his eyes down and looked at what was in his hands. Fiona was delighted, clenched her hands into fists and shook them. Lights danced in her eyes, just as the tea was about to cool down a little. As soon as Ernst took a sip, he was overcome by familiar sensations. Unable to believe that the taste of tea was familiar, he could not take his eyes off the cup. He missed this taste so much, the tea that his wife Gabriella made. The girl leaned forward. She was curious about the young man's reaction and waited for an answer, but she could not remain silent and said that tea with honey tasted much better. A smile barely touched the lady's lips. She asked questions and expected answers, while pushing the guy towards the truth, fleetingly giving a reminder of the villainess. She put the cup on the saucer. It was empty. Now it's time for her to leave, she said quietly, said goodbye and wished good night. The cup stood on the table. Ernst was left alone. Only a trail of perfume followed the princess. She quickly left, just as she had appeared, leaving behind questions. Gabriella also loved tea with honey, I remembered. There were many questions, but there was no answer. Strange feelings. The commander was afraid that the girl would use some kind of tactics. He leaned back on the sofa. The princess reminded him of his wife, but the man convinced himself that he had come up with everything. He was sure of one thing. He knew for sure. He put his hand to his head, pondering what he should do with the princess. He would not place her in the east wing, but would carefully watch her. But he couldn't get rid of the strange feeling. He recalled his Gabriella. She was a respected duchess. She often did not laugh, but when she turned and gave a smile, a man could not remain indifferent. In the end, Ernst had to break the terms of the contract, which stated that they should not fall in love, but the girl did not leave her heart alone. It was a passionate love, the man recognized. He was distracted by everything connected with it. And when, after so many nights of dreaming about the villainess, it seemed that he needed no one else but her, but then she was taken from him. Ernst shrank, bent forward, grieved, wanted to be happy with Gabriella, but it didn't work out, and now he's tormented by thoughts about Princess Fiona. The next day, the girl did not suspect that she was tormented by the man's thoughts, stretched, and took a deep breath of fresh air. She exhaled and saw the soldiers sitting near the fire. Every day she had the feeling that there was no home. It was depressing. Fiona saw the glances directed at her, and there was contempt in them. They did not accept her, but the smile did not leave her face. This is a role. Something caught the princess's attention. She clenched her fists and stopped. Some of the soldiers were holding their mouths. The young people covered their mouths with their hands, coughed. The cough was dry, and everyone in the detachment fell ill with it. The girl stared at them, opened her mouth, realized that they were all sick, and did not know how to react. She said it loudly so that everyone could hear her. The maid started to step aside, but was not embarrassed, and the lady indicated her business to them. All the young men, hearing the princess's voice, turned to look at her and stared in anticipation, holding mugs with something hot in their hands, steam coming from them. Giving these people a smile, she offered tea with honey, because when she is sick, she always drinks it. She saw that the cough was strong and decided to help. She ordered them to drink it. The young men were confused, looked at each other, but remained silent. They did not know how to react to the princess's action. Sophia was indignant. They cannot accept ordinary tea, because it is so difficult to prepare. She was angry. Precious honey was used, drawn out, stuffed into honeycombs, cinnamon, and even lemon was added. The maid ground her teeth, reprimanded the soldiers, got angry and screamed, because her anger was justified. The ingredients were not so easy to get. The girls had done the hard work. The princess sacrificed her expensive jewelry to get all this, sent a maid, no one knew about it, so she was angry. And remembering how she stirred this broth until she turned blue, she fell into an even greater rage and spilled everything on the guys. After Sophia's speech, the young people exhaled. One of them decided to try it and raised a glass to his mouth, but they stopped him, holding his hand. They didn't believe that he decided to take a drink. They calmed him down. The princess couldn't harm them. Still, having decided, he took a sip, opened his mouth in surprise. It was very tasty and was embarrassed. In front of a large smoking cauldron, the guys stood in line for the broth. The maid deftly wielded a ladle and gave orders. Fiona watched from the side. Sophia got excited, raised the ladle, and shouted that you need to be grateful for the gifts. There is no need to remain silent. The princess showered with gratitude. She smiled joyfully. Her maid would like such words. Later in the evening, the warriors were sitting around the fire. The heroine was watching them. There was a cough, but it was smaller and not so strong. She thought that if she had behaved this way when she was Gabriella, could it have changed anything? But then she was indifferent to everything. After marriage, she thought about how to survive. She became happy when she gave her heart. Due to indecision, the girl was able to approach Ernst only after many attempts. She was afraid that he would not reciprocate her feelings. It was exactly the same with the guys. She was afraid to approach them. She thought they wouldn't accept her, a temporary duchess, but now she regretted it. Fiona laughed. Her cheeks turned pink. She will bring more tomorrow, not much. There is a little honey left. Among the young people I saw Christian. He was sitting and scooping up the remains from a mug with a spoon. I first saw him when he was 17 years old. All the soldiers were dear, but 5 especially stood out. Sebastian, Ernst's friend, and faithful assistant Christine, distinguished by his devotion. The bravest of all was Brigald. The girl missed them no less. 2 more, Valken and Geiss, were dear and loved. Giving everyone around her a smile, the princess sat down carefully next to Christian and greeted him. She waved her hand at him, closed her eyes, could not believe that the young man had matured so much and grown up, now older than her. He got up and did not talk to the girl, only told her to stop watching them and return to the carriage. Satisfied with herself, the heroine understood that it would be very difficult to join them again, not so easy. Then Fiona called him by his last name. The young man turned sharply towards her. Discouraged, he did not tell. The girl slowly approached him. If they had time to get acquainted, was her answer, but personal hostility should not be openly shown. She walked past, touched the ends of the man's hair, dropped this non-officer business, turned around and smiled. Christian's reaction provoked the heroine, raising her hand to her mouth and grinning. It was still fun to bother him. If he hasn't changed, he will think about her words, because he doesn't take such things thoughtlessly. He checks her to see if the lady is a threat. The girl wanted to be watched closely. This is what she achieved. The desire was for Christian to watch. I hoped that the guy would find out the truth and recognize Gabriella in her. If her plan didn't work, it would be sad. Even if they don't fall in love with Ernst again, it won't change the fact that she is still the Duchess of the North. Everyone has their own ocean there. The task is to illuminate it. Looking back, the girl understood the path she had already traveled. That was enough. The next day, someone persistently woke up the princess, forced her to get up. But the dream was sweet. She put her hand under her cheek and slept peacefully. Now the forces of day and the forces of night have united, so uprisings cannot be avoided, no matter how much you want it, the heroine expectedly believed. She got up, looked out the window, and clarified what had happened. A smile lit up everything around, despite the gloomy morning. A man in a white frock coat appeared before her eyes. He introduced himself, put his hand to his chest. He was responsible for transporting provisions. He was worried that the northern troops would come and demand to share. Gekon was indignant and seething at this, considered the northern fleet stupid and narcissistic, and threw out his arms in anger. Fiona put her hands to her mouth, without removing her smile and the light emanating from her. She understood that they thought that the girl was on the side of the forces of the day. Already all red from his scream, the man did not calm down. He needed to save the provisions and not give them away so easily. He tried to reach her with his indignation. The heroine expected this, so she was not impressed. He narrowed his eyes, his teeth gritted. All his anger was directed at the princess. He wanted the northern soldiers to beg for food. Unable to bear it, he began to call the girl outside for a conversation. Looking at him from the carriage was not enough. She came forward, put her finger to her cheek, asked a question, pretended that she didn't understand what was happening and what to do. He saw the lady, stopped short, considered her a complete fool, and what was she babbling about, opened his mouth and stepped back. The emperor entrusted this young man with an important matter, his chance to succeed and strengthen his position in the court. But when he looked at the heroine, his stomach began to turn. He came closer to the girl, towered over her, and looked from above. He thought that Fiona was too young for such questions. She was not afraid of the man hanging over her. She looked with her green eyes. He continued talking about her youth. The heroine interrupted him, opened her mouth. A grin appeared in the corners of her lips. She laughed, narrowing her eyes, played her role perfectly. But there was no point in offending her husband's army. She brought up her folded hands. It was not worth mentioning the emperor often. She suggested that Gekon imagined himself to be a monarch. She turned away from him, put her hand to her eyes, just looking at him turned her back, called him a careless man. The man's jaw dropped, his face darkened. He was furious with anger, but he couldn't do anything. He sent him to the palace. Having lost his reasoning from anger, Gekon yelled at the girl that he had no right to judge him. Fiona swayed, putting her hand to her forehead. She didn't want to see his comrades. She gave the order for everyone to leave immediately. Otherwise, they would lose consciousness. The soldiers were taken aback when they heard this. They opened their mouths. It seemed that their jaws dropped to the floor. They did not understand what their fault was. Her hand was on her head. Her eyes were closed. She didn't feel well, which she notified people about. Christian watched this performance. The girl smiled, walked away, turned around, and said that you shouldn't be such a sissy just because you don't like someone. She was stunned by the young man standing behind Gekon, that he was now responsible for moving the provisions. The guy was confused, pointed at himself, asked again, and the emperor's nephew looked at him very unkindly. After thinking, the young man rejoiced, clenched his hands into fists. He wants this position and is better in many ways. Gekon squealed, shook his fist. No one dares to stand in his way. Close to the emperor, he was proud of it. The men collided, shouting and indignant. One talked about the emperor, the other about the princess, shouting at each other. A fight began. Gekon could not stand it, shouting an insult, raised his fist, and grabbed the guy by the scruff of the neck. Meanwhile, the princess was pleased with herself. Everything was going according to plan. A few days ago, she distributed tea and observed people's relationships. I closed my eyes, was glad of the work done, identified my opponents, and now there was an excellent result. Sebastian crept up to the girl inaudibly, whispering in her ear, making her eyes widen and shudder. Having met her face, the guy gave her a gorgeous smile and wished her good morning. He put his hand to his chest, introduced himself, an officer of the Northern Fleet. The young man suggested he could help the lady sort out this mess. Embarrassed, the girl smiled. She allowed her to do whatever she wanted. She was pleased to meet you. Sebastian left, but reminded that the girl should not see this showdown. She folded her hands together. This fleeting concern was pleasant. The appearance of Ernst forced the soldiers to stand to attention and salute. Fiona mumbled something nearby. Having become a nice girl, she reported to the man that the soldiers protected her and everything was fine. She nodded in agreement. The Duke repeated the guy's words that she didn't belong here, shouldn't witness such situations, and would take her home. He turned to leave, but the girl held him back with her hand by the fabric. He didn't understand what was happening. He turned to face her. Fiona screamed that she would not move from her place until this man left. She sprayed so much that her cheeks turned red. To get closer to Ernst, she needs to show which side she is on, so she needs to get rid of the forces of the day. Gaken shouted about the misunderstanding. The commander changed his face and walked towards the guy. The girl followed him with an alarmed look. He leaned on the sword. His gaze was stern, his eyebrows furrowed. He turned to Gaken so that he listened to him carefully. He was no longer responsible for the provisions. The former pharmacist was lying on the ground. His hand was pierced by a sword. The soldiers who were behind listened to the order and saluted. He turned to the lady and asked her not to do anything. It was a good way to keep the enemy in place. Sophia ran, pushing aside the soldiers, screaming and stretching out her hand in an attempt to stop the inevitable. The maid attacked Gaken, sat down and began to choke him, cursed and behaved aggressively. She could not forgive the bastard for what he did to her princess. Fiona felt uncomfortable and put her hand to her mouth when she heard that Sophia demanded to give up the hairpin and that not a single person in the world would exchange an emerald hairpin for a jar of honey. And at the same moment, conversations were heard from the soldiers, whispering. They were impressed by the girl's action, and the maid confirmed, pointed her finger at the man, that she did not just give away the honey and then brought a hairpin. The soldiers began to scream. They had no idea that they were drinking such expensive tea. They thought, scratched their cheek with a finger. They directed their anger at Gaken. It's not a matter of deceiving the good princess. Ernst looked at this. Blueness splashed in his eyes. Lightning discharges rose from within. But outwardly he was calm. Only his eyes betrayed him. The next day, it was announced that the man who disrespected the princess was sentenced to death. Ernst heard that the soldiers who had caught a cold were given tea with honey and expressed his gratitude to the girl for this. He warned that next time if the princess needed something, she should contact him. The Duke looked at her without blinking. She looked away and fidgeted with her hands nervously. She just didn't want to disturb the man and finally gave it away. He turned around to leave. Ernst did not turn around, and the girl mentally screamed. Her heart beat in a frantic rhythm, begging to remember, to guess that she was Gabriella. My throat was tight. I couldn't utter a word. I put my hand to my chest. My gaze followed him and asked me to remember. The ship stood on the pier. A gangway was laid from it so that people could climb up and bring in the necessary things. Sebastian adjusted his glasses. The commander expelled half of the soldiers, the guy asked again, clarifying. And these are only those whom the emperor sent away personally. The young man rejoiced at the circumstances on their side. Ernst was surprised that the soldiers treated the princess favorably, looked at the water, and shared his thoughts with his assistant. The young man nodded his head, agreeing. Bosses often take advantage of their position to control the weakest, but on the other hand, it's refreshing, like honey tea. The guy laughed. The commander turned around sharply, looked at Sebastian and saw changes in him for the better. They saw the maid and the carriage where the princess was. The assistant explained that the soldiers came because they were worried about the girl. Unlike the first prince, she was kind to them. Sophia did not let anyone near the carriage, shouted that it was none of their business, and staunchly defended the princess. In fact, Sebastian continued, they were going to meet today with the investigation team sent by the royal family, and Fiona was supposed to join them. Initially, the royal family and the Duke were in a difficult situation, trying to maintain balance, but the lands of the night lack provisions. They have magical oil, a lot of valuable oil. With this marriage, the North is in an advantageous position. Thanks to the princess, the situation has changed radically. Food supplies, bright grass, experts, and research. All this seems impossible to Ernst. An agreement was drawn up. It contained several articles that talked about offspring and rewards, pastime. They could accept these conditions. All the same, everything will always be not enough for them, the man thought. He will never accept anyone next to him except his wife Gabriella. And so Ernst stands in front of the princess's carriage, knocks on the door. The wait lasts for many minutes. The last thought he had was that there was no one but the villainess. Before Fiona jumped out of the carriage, flashing a smile. Their eyes met, time slowed down, not paying attention to anything. Lightning slipped between them. The girl fell into the man's arms, buried herself in his shoulder, and was enveloped in a smell that was so familiar, so familiar. They walked along the street. Fiona under an umbrella from the bright sun. Ernst in front, people passed by. The heroine held the umbrella with both hands, looked down and thought about what happened. The man asked to go for a walk and was now wondering. His voice rang out, warning that a little later he would introduce her to the research team. He turned around and was discouraged by the fact that he would appoint the head of this detachment. He would lead. She opened her mouth at this. She did not know what to say. I looked at her and continued to talk about how they had been trying to find a cure for night sickness for a long time. But nothing had worked out, so they were very happy to gather experts from different fields. He stood in front of her and bowed sharply to the girl, thereby expressing gratitude to her for her help. Without full of head, he said that if she didn't like something, he would fix it. He asked only for one thing, not to expel anyone. Fiona did not expect this. She leaned towards him, stopping him, but not risking touching, and rattled out agreement if only the man would get up. The lady had no intention of expelling her. There are many important people in the duchy, but she herself thought that this guy had not changed. He was still the same, sacrificing himself for the common good. The character lit up the street with a smile, closed her eyes, and offered to make people happy together. Ernst stood and clenched his fists when the girl now bent down in front of him. He was confused and did not understand what he was doing. While she was in a bending position, she realized that something was happening. A strange feeling arose in her chest. She felt pain. The princess fell onto the pavement, spread out her arms, and covered her face with her hair. The girl was flying somewhere down. She was warm and painful. Her hair was scattered and falling down. Opening her eyes, she saw Ernst's smiling face. The shirt on his chest fell open. A blush appeared on his cheeks. The heroine smiled. They were supposed to board the ship. Apparently they were late, she was wondering. She jumped up, sat down on the guy. He rose up on his elbows, folded his arms on his chest, and playfully threatened him, teased him. The Duchess was testing his patience. The man exhaled, succumbing to her. It was too hot. The lady gasped when he wrapped his hand around her waist, bringing her closer to him. It was too intimate. It was too hot in the room. He called her Gabi. Seeing her pink hair, she drooped, became confused, sat down on the bed, stretching out her arms, a little surprised that he called her by name. I jumped up in the four-poster bed and saw Saphira, who had fallen to her knees and was collecting dishes. It was like a dream. Fiona covered her eyes with her hand, trying to understand how long they had been swimming. The maid talked about her experiences when the Duke personally carried her into the cabin in her arms. But it turned out that they did not sail. Since the wind had strengthened, they needed to wait until tomorrow. Saphira went to report to the captain about her awakening, and the lady looked around the cabin. It's not surprising that they settled the sick princess here, the captain's best room. I saw the clock. There was still time. You could get up and meet the squad. They knocked on the door and opened it sharply, apologized. It was Ernst. A short old man came in with the man, brought a doctor to examine the girl, and let him go ahead. He smiled, narrowed his eyes. The old man introduced himself. He asked permission to examine the girl if she would mind. Lorenzo went to the bed, counted the pulse. The man was nearby and watched as his best doctor in the duchy performed an examination. She remembered her dream, wondered what it was. The vision was so bright, and the nickname sounded. That's what her husband called her. This was Fiona's world. It was lonely, and no one could understand her in this, tearing pain. The doctor said that he didn't notice anything strange about the girl. Apparently she was tired from the long drive. Ernst was surprised at this. The lady was sad. Her eyes were full of bitterness. Everything was fine with her, but it was not normal. No normal person would lose consciousness after a trip to the north. She grabbed Ernst's sleeve, stopping him. She needed to meet with the research team. He turned his head away from her, tried not to look. She needed to rest and threw it without turning. She screamed loudly, blushed, attracting attention to herself, and wrinkled her nose. Closing the door behind her, the girl was left alone in the room, standing on the floor, absent-minded and lost. The princess didn't know whether it was a mirage or a dream. She really hoped that this was her future. She longed for it, because Ernst smiled and recognized it. The wood was crackling in the fireplace. The room was warm. Fiona stood on the floor for a while. They had a long way to get to each other and exhaled. And on the deck, looking far out to sea, a man stood and thought, leaning his hands on the railing, his shoulders tense. It seemed that the guy was going crazy. The fear was so familiar, imprinted in his heart when he saw the girl fall. I remembered old Lorenzo because of his illness, but I was still worried. The princess was so reminiscent of Gabriella. I understood that these were two different people. Fiona quietly approached the guy, called him, shuddered, and squinted his eyes at her. He looked at her with an attentive gaze, not sitting still, he thought to this girl, but remained silent and did not say out loud. He looked up from the railing, turned to her, reminded her about the rest. Fiona shook her head. She would be calmer next to him. She handed him a sandwich, smiling, and offered to have a snack together. The girl doesn't take no for an answer. The man took the food, absent-mindedly muttered that he asked the cook to bring him dinner, but did not finish his speech. Everything was clear without words. Fiona nodded, saying that the sandwich was very tasty. As soon as I tried a piece, I realized that they tasted very similar to the ones Gabriella made. But I remembered that the girl said that she asked the cook to cook, and I drove away the vague doubt. He turned away sharply, raised his hand to his mouth. Fiona saw this, became alarmed, raised her hand to touch, but did not dare. He turned around completely, grabbed the railing. The girl next to him closed her eyes and began to sing a song. The man was dumbfounded. He knew this song, the song of the nymph Nereid, and was surprised that the princess was singing the song of sailors. This melody flowed from the heroine, confused, without ceasing. It sounded, quietly spread in the silence. The Duke could not resist and could not stop it. Peace and tranquility overtook Ernst. Without taking his eyes off, he listened to the song. She was called out by the soldiers who went up on deck and wanted more songs. The girl invited them to sing together. And the soldiers, echoing her, hugging each other, sang songs, diffused the situation, were embarrassed, but did not stop singing. Even if she were pretending, everything would be noticeable from fatigue. But Fiona was sincere, and anyone who doubts this may be ashamed. She raised her hand up and waved to the guy. There was a radiant smile on her face, and Ernst imagined Gabi when he looked at the princess. The man always wanted to know. He looked at her. He had to find out right now. The man did not forget Gabriella. She was everywhere, in memories, in dreams, in reality. He did not forget even after her death. The court physician Lorenzo could not look at the young man in such a state and prescribed medication. After this, Ernst began to pretend that everything was fine, but the pain from losing his wife was strong, and he could not forget her. He admitted to himself that he couldn't take his eyes off the princess, because she looked so much like Gabi. He tried not to notice, but now he had to find out. Fiona smiled, narrowing her eyes. A blush appeared on her cheeks. Be sure to find out to the man why they were so similar. The next morning, breakfast was fun. The girl at the head of the table covered her mouth with her hand. The rest sat and listened to her, sometimes smiling. The princess was glad that these were the emperor's ambassadors, and not strangers. Everything was fine. She calmed down. I emerged from my thoughts, heard that someone could not be here due to weather conditions. My eyes widened. Urion was a magician. The man next to him shared his doubts about whether his abilities were needed here. The princess laughed, put her hands under her chin. The guy didn't believe in magic, she thought. A girl in glasses approached her. She said that upon arrival at the port, they would go to the laboratory. They would report on the results and budget for 3 months. Trisha, it was she, with a ponytail of brown hair, wearing glasses with thick glass, the head of this research group, understood that the princess would not fully understand the report, but wanted to share. She raised her hands up, shouted that she would try to help them, and confused those present with such zeal. There was silence. Only the guy who was nearby turned to the princess, saying that they would soon be there when the trace of the girl disappeared. She was already on the deck and peered at her native lands. The sea breeze developed her pink hair, without looking away from her. Ernst called out to her, but rejoicing and smiling from ear to ear, Fiona looked at her house. She turned to the Duke. The happy smile did not leave her face. They finally returned home. These words made the man freeze, looking at the girl without blinking, not believing what he heard. The path from the port to the house was not too short. Ernst looked at the girl, tiredly bowed her head, leaned on his shoulder, and breathed heavily. An elderly man met them, introduced himself, and bowed. The princess recognized the butler. She straightened up, put her hand to her chest, smiling. She was happy. She wanted to introduce herself, but didn't have time. Because she remembered that she had to act stupid, Ernst stepped forward and looked at Fiona. I couldn't find anything to say to the man, so I just rushed to hug the old man, introduced myself, and giggled. Owen did not show that this was strange. He answered the lady quite friendly and asked the maid to take her to her chambers. The girl was met by a sweet old lady. She would prepare a bath for her because she was tired from the road. She smiled and asked to call her Grandma Betty. Fiona was flattered by such cordiality. She rushed into the arms of the old woman. Granny would take care of her. Ernst turned around and was about to leave. He needed to rest, but he nodded his head slightly to the butler. Fiona smiled a sweet smile. The joy of being home hurried Betty to go. The heroine basked in a large bathtub, closed her eyes, The water caressed her delicate skin. Her voice clarified the temperature of the water. The girl turned around, asked Saphira to call her madam, and explained that she was a princess by birth, but now a duchess. Betty gave Fiona a strange look. The girl realized that such words were not expected from a princess who had lived all her life in the palace. Already at night, the heroine went out in a light nightgown onto the balcony, where the sea was. She enjoyed the smell of the sea, although she did not have the duchess's chambers, but she was glad that she was not shoved into the east wing. Fiona wondered. Her cheeks turned red. Since the guy allowed him to stay here, it means he was slowly opening up to her. She was happy. I remembered when Betty was washing the girl's hair, they started talking about the Duke. People considered him kind. They hoped that she would like them. The man scratched his head and looked away. It would be better if they were alone, but for now they need to sleep together for at least 2 weeks. The girl looked at him admiringly. He had 2 questions for her. Now they will discuss everything. He didn't look at Fiona, looked away, started talking about the first question. The families of the day live in different rooms to preserve the personal space of the spouses. If you want to have a lover, it will be easier. After all, she, the princess of the forces of the day, must be used to this. Looked down at the girl with a deep look of blue eyes. The forces of the night live together. For now they must stick to this and try not to bring anyone, the man said. Fiona was embarrassed. She doesn't need this. Her reaction was strange, but the heroine hugged herself by the shoulders and smiled blissfully. She wanted to share the same room with her husband. The second question also concerned the guests of the mansion. There was a girl, Charlotte, who turns 11 this year. This was a faithful family. This family had a daughter. 3 years ago there was a war, and the count died in this war. The man bowed his head. Died saving his life, protecting the Duke, not sparing himself, but asked to take care of his daughter. Since then, Charlotte has been his weakness. He put his hand to his eyes. The girl had night sickness, so he allowed her to stay here, because he bears great responsibility for her. The young man thought it was selfish of him, but wanted to leave Charlotte and make him his younger sister. Fiona exclaimed. She was happy that she would have a sister, took his hand and pressed it to hers. But there was one condition that the girl put forward. The guy could expect anything, but not the next words. She asked to do this with her, to adopt together. She offered to conclude a marriage contract. The man was taken aback by this. He did not expect such words. The girl had behaved unpredictably before. I remembered Gabriella. She also offered to conclude an agreement, to do it together. The parallel was increasingly drawn by him. She touched his hand with her palm, looked up. There will be only 4 conditions, she said. The first condition, the girl smiled, closing her eyes, showed her finger. This agreement will be valid for 5 years. They must pretend that they love each other. The second condition was also stated, and she showed 3 fingers. There will be respect for their partners. Issues will be resolved through conversations. If after 5 years someone wants to get a divorce, the contract will be extended. When Gabi died, she regretted only one thing, that time was lost. They had so little of the 2 of them. She didn't want a repetition. She didn't want to waste time. While Fiona was in her thoughts, the Duke exhaled sharply. He did not want to hide the truth from her, so he answered quietly, but so that she could hear. Standing opposite each other, he wanted to be honest with her. So he considered the first condition impossible to fulfill. He would not be able to love the princess. She will try to avoid rumors that his life is unhappy. There will be respect for her. She smiled sweetly. That will be enough, she agreed. They crossed their little fingers. Even if he forgot Gabi, even if there was no love between them, she needed the guy and didn't want enmity between them. I wanted to return his smile. The man frowned. It was too late, and it was time to go to bed. The next morning, as she stretched sweetly in bed, the girl opened her eyes and allowed those who were calling her outside the door to enter. 2 girls appeared in front of her, Saphira, and introduced the new girl. They would help her get ready. She jumped out of bed. Fiona stared at the smiling Hazel. It was the maid's granddaughter. Sitting down at the mirror and peering into it, she did not react to the girl's surprise. She simply asked him to take care of her. She smiled and asked about Ernst. When she woke up, he was no longer there, curious where he was. Hazel smiled. She held a hairbrush in her hands and replied that the Duke had already left for the port. The maids gathered her in 2 hands. The dress was emerald, but her face was sad. She thought that the man, as always, was trying for everyone, but she couldn't sit still. Coming out into the living room, she looked down the stairs. All the servants of the palace greeted her and bowed in her honor. The old butler and Grandma Betty were also there. They also bowed and wished good morning. He put his hand to her chest, asked how her morning went, how her rest was, closed his eyes, and sincerely showed concern. The lady was pleased. There was a time when I heard a greeting every morning. It made my heart beat faster. She also saw a child who was hiding behind the butler's leg and was embarrassed to show herself to the princess. The girl came out of her hiding place, clutched something to her chest, introduced herself timidly, and looked at the lady with her own eyes. Bottomless eyes, empty pupils. Charlotte had too many symptoms of night sickness. She leaned towards the girl. Her smile was wide. The girl was sincerely glad to meet her. Fiona treated the baby very kindly and even suggested calling her sister. She held out what she was clutching tightly to her chest. Charlotte wanted to give this scarf. She knitted it herself. She decided to give it as a gift because it was cold outside. The girl was delighted, immediately put on the scarf. It was very cute. A gentle warmth enveloped her neck and thanked her. But suddenly, a scream was heard, and everyone present turned to the door to see who was screaming so hard. Some woman grabbed a little girl in her arms and asked if she was injured and if she was okay. Owen scolded the young girl to introduce herself first, placing his hands behind his back. She straightened up and made the excuse that she was worried about Charlotte. It was Rachel, the girl's teacher, who felt unwell. She handed Saphira a scarf, and she herself noticed every detail, the fact that she was not called a lady, and there was no address to the girl. This is their first meeting, but the princess said something else, that if you rush through the corridors like that, you can get hurt. She laughed, raised her hand to her mouth. Rachel may no longer say hello in the morning. Otherwise, Charlotte will learn bad manners. Miss raised her hands to her chest, looked scared. She didn't understand. The princess was angry with her. The heroine thought that she was making a victim of herself. She laughed. It was the first time she had seen a noble man rush so frivolously through the corridors of the palace. Having approached the girl closely, she grabbed her by the shoulders when she felt bad and didn't even have the strength to move. She turned around, rubbing her hands. Rachel's face darkened. The greeting did not take place due to the conflict, but now they will make it official. She continued to say that she was glad that everyone came on time. Starting today, everyone will say hello at the same time. She wouldn't dismiss anyone just like that. Everyone looked. She wanted to make friends with everyone who worked in the palace. There will be no servants of the forces of the day here, but he will not offend his maid Saphira. The guys looked at each other and smiled. She leaned over to the girl and made an announcement that she would now be a little princess, and smiled at her. This is where I finished my speech. Now you need to perceive Charlotte as the Duke's little sister. All the servants bowed to her and shouted their greetings, but the girl was in shock. And as soon as Rachel stood there and batted her big doe eyes, Fiona turned to her. She looked at the teacher from above. A smile was on her lips, but not so sincere and kind. She commanded to bow. Finally, the princess achieved what she wanted. Rachel lowered her head, bowed her darkened face. Satisfied with herself, Fiona looked to the side. Now the order was given to address Charlotte only as Miss. Her face darkened, her eyes betrayed anger, and the question of what was happening was ringing in her head. She rushed down the corridor, her skirt fluttering, her fists clenched in indignation. She considered herself the only noble person in the mansion. She thought that she would someday be with the Duke, so she became a teacher. Rachel stopped abruptly and saw people led by Ernst. They were walking forward. She jumped up to the man, clasped her hands, and looked with the eyes of a doe and screamed. She extended her hand to his hand. She needed to tell him something, but before she could touch it, a voice was heard nearby. Sebastian jumped out in front of the Duke, covered himself with a folder, and smiled. The lenses of his glasses sparkled. She said congratulations. The smile did not leave her lips, but her thoughts were black. She thought that the assistant was an idiot, always at the wrong time. He was surprised that this had already been announced. He put the folder to his lips, but it had not yet been officially said. She covered her mouth with her hand, said that the princess was impatient, said hello to everyone, and could not resist telling. She believed that this was a chance to humiliate her. These are the powers of the day that sounded from her lips. Sebastian looked at her slyly, saw through the girl, but listened. The forces of the day cannot stand those who are susceptible to night sickness. She continued to develop her thoughts out loud if Charlotte would suffer because of the princess, but did not finish completely. How the Duke interrupted her, without hearing her. She continued to utter her arguments about the fact that she was a teacher. When they stopped her, she was confused. Now Charlotte should be called a lady, the Duke said, repeating Fiona's words exactly. He reminded her that their marriage was a personal matter, not public, and therefore did not concern a simple teacher, and threw it over his shoulder as he left. And they left, leaving the girl looking at their backs, anger bubbling inside her, something the princess was using. Her lips were shaking. Rachel's face was gloomy. Dark thoughts were swirling. She needed to find the truth by all means and reveal it. She bit her finger, thought about it, and heard that there was another royal member of the family in the West Wing. I looked through the window at the roof of the extension. His name was Johann, and thought of something bad. And at that time, the princess asked the butler how much a change of mood costs, and asked a question that worried her. He dabbed his face with a napkin, wiped away the beads of sweat, laughed. It must have been expensive, but he really dreamed. He opened his eyes and looked at the girl after saying that it would be great to introduce tourism here. I remember there was already such a conversation when Gabriella was inspired by the same idea. She laughed, blushed. It was a polar night in the duchy. She had never seen it. She gave it away at the end. She thought about it, because then she had no help from the forces of the day, but now she can use it. She turned to Owen. Her skirts fluttered behind her. A smile shone on her face. An idea appeared. The butler was discouraged by the princess's behavior. She reminded him of Gabriella so much, as if they had known each other for a long time. I entered the living room late in the evening. I didn't notice the time had passed, while I walked around the whole palace. The girl was sad. They were already waiting for her at the table. Charlotte jumped up and shouted greetings. The Duke was also standing near the chair. He looked at her with respect and asked how her first day in the duchy went. She laughed, raised her hands to her mouth. She was happy. She walked through familiar places, so time passed quickly. A man stopped near the chair at the head and said confidently that this was now her place. The servants noticed what attitude the Duke had towards his wife, would not give rise to rumors. Everything was as he promised. She was flattered by this attitude, nodded in agreement, and her heart beat faster. She closed her eyes. Her face became crimson. She felt good. Thanks to the man, she let go of all her worries. I looked at Charlotte, asked who she wanted to become, and when she heard about the artist, she was very surprised. I succumbed to it, became interested, even forgot about food, and expressed a desire to see it somehow. The Duke also looked up from his meal and echoed Fiona, hoping that he would see this too. Then the princess reminded her of the brooch, which is attached to her chest and opens all the doors in the courtyard. And the guy agreed with her, stood up. It is necessary to give her such a thing. They looked at each other. Charlotte screamed. The poor child didn't want to distract him from his work. They were so busy, there was no point in bothering him. She turned to the young man. How was the third prince and the inspection? A conversation ensued between them, discussing the uninvited guest. This person's presence here was planned for too long, about a month. They were not happy about it. He wiped his lips with a napkin. Ernst closed his eyes. The girl knew that he would now go back to work. Then she took a glass of wine and offered him a drink. A smile lit up her face. You need to drink to the Count and Countess. The young man noticed that Fiona was picking at her food with a fork, removing cucumbers, and noticed that she didn't like cucumbers. The girl did not raise her head, was busy eating, answered without thinking that she did not like them. It turned out that the Duke did not either. He muttered that the previous Duchess didn't like them either. The lady laughed, and was feignedly surprised at such a coincidence. He offered to choose a brooch. You can choose anyone. Received a report that the girl took few things with her, put his hand on the table, and turned to her. But the lady didn't need jewelry. It's not worth spending money on it. She put her head down cutely. It's better to invest in the mansion. But the man insisted on his own. There is no need to save. There is enough money for the contribution. Fiona was surprised by this, but while she is in the body of a girl, she needs to take advantage of this. Suddenly, he held out a piece of paper to her, asked for help, and doubted whether Charlotte's middle name was appropriate. She laughed, thought that the girl had written it herself, suggested EK's, smiled, closing her eyes, and was pleased with her actions. He raised a glass of wine to his lips. He liked it. It wasn't that bad, so be it. He said it and took a sip. Putting her hand to her chin, the girl smiled and asked the man if there was some place where she was not allowed. Curiosity took over her, what kind of place it was. A little later, the two of them were already walking along the corridor, Ernst in front. In this mansion she can walk anywhere, but she shouldn't go into the underground prison. And he stopped in front of the massive door. It is undesirable to enter the former Duchess's bedroom. He turned to her. This place was not for everyone. He hoped for her understanding, so you shouldn't come here, the man said quietly. The girl laughed and asked to go there just once. She wanted to know how the previous Duchess lived. The man opened the door. Nothing had changed. The bed was neatly made. Things remained the same untouched. She walked up to the pulled-back chair. A blush colored her cheeks. Everything was dear to her heart. She smiled a dreamy smile, remembering the warm moments. Ernst did not remain silent. He said that the room had not been cleaned for a long time. The dust could have settled. but this was an obvious lie. Here it seemed at first glance that the room was not tidy, but it was not so, it was perfectly clean. The man knew that he should have dealt with this even before marrying Fiona, but he couldn't, clenching his hand into a fist. The heroine couldn't believe that she hadn't done anything. She exhaled barely audibly and whispered her question to Ernst. The Duke's words made her raise her head and stare at him. A blush burned her cheeks, and repeated after him the words about love. The character believed that she had already forgotten her, that she would not look again and everything had passed, but what she heard now made her heart beat faster. She remembered the time when only paper knew about her feelings. She sat and shed tears over a letter that she would never have sent. Inadvertently, she touched the bookshelf, from which a book fell and opened to reveal letters. I picked up the letters and was surprised where they came from. The heroine was silent and looked at her husband. Inside Fiona, Gabriella thought about how she didn't sleep for long nights, how much she loved the man, cried, poured out her soul on paper. The hands clutched the paper tighter, the gaze became gloomy. The letter contained the feelings of a woman, loneliness, a true friend. The princess saw his sad look full of pain, took his hands in hers, and quietly called, sharing the pain between two. He passed his hand, throwing her hands off his. She was confused, brought them to her chest, and in her eyes there was a question that she could not ask. Clutching the letter in his hand, he apologized to the girl and asked her to go to her chambers. She closed the door behind her, waved her palm, and hiding a happy smile, said goodbye. Ernst rubbed his eyes with his hand, sat near the door with that very book, exhaled heavily. He could not imagine that this was possible. He looked down sadly. Apparently his words then hurt the girl more, and reread all the letters. His desire was to die that day with Gabi, but the coincidences that the man noticed caused crazy thoughts about rebirth. I didn't understand my actions, why I wanted to be kind to the princess. I asked myself a question, but he knew one thing, that the only woman he loved was Gabriella, and would never replace her. He walked down the corridor. In the large hall, Charlotte and Fiona were sitting at the table. They were busy reading. The silence was palpable. For a long time, the heroine was looking for information about the relic of the Duke's house, and finally found a clue. Everyone's favorite snake, the moon goddess, and nowhere and everywhere, she was everywhere, reminiscent of the description of the ring. She bent down, reading what was said about the sea serpent, and without looking up, grabbed it with both hands. I bit my finger, thought about it, reread it again, didn't understand, assumed that this was prose about greatness. She wondered where the ring was. Ernst definitely didn't have it. She was afraid that it remained in Gabriella's body, because by swallowing it, she thought she would save it. She grabbed her head, but for now she couldn't talk about it so easily on the strength of the day, so she was seething from inaction. She can only wait for the man himself to talk about it, but that's not the only thing she'll have to wait for. But we still have to wait for a cure for night sickness to be invented. Charlotte sat and looked into space. The medicine will have to be made by Saint Ingrid, a red-haired girl, a medicine that will cure all diseases. The main component is unicorn tears, a divine concentrate that can cure any disease, just one drop, and you can resurrect the dead. You can get the tears of a unicorn on the border of the territory of the forces of day and night. Only those with a pure heart can meet a unicorn in the shining forest. If you get the tears, you can cure Charlotte's vision. The girl was distracted from her thoughts by Sebastian, who smiled and adjusted his glasses, closed his eyes, and announced that Galahad would arrive. The girl jumped out of her chair, screamed with joy. "Hilda and Valken will come," she asked. The man opened the map and decided to explain to the girl that Galahad's main mission is protection from pirates. He pointed his finger at the enemy from whom they protect ships and receive appropriate payment for it. The Navy specializes in pirates, which is how a military triangle is formed, he explained to her. Fiona folded her hands, smiled. She realized that thanks to the fleet, help was being provided. She should not forget about the polar nights. The man praised her and called her smart. "We need to organize a small event in honor of the return of the fleet." The guy suggested that the girl do it. Fiona exclaimed joyfully, jumped up and raised her hand. "It is a great privilege to organize a holiday for the fleet." She got up from the table. The heroine offered to go shopping for the girl too, but she was confused. It certainly sounds fun, but she was afraid of something. She bowed her head. Charlotte felt sad. She didn't want to be a burden on this trip. It was better for her to stay in the mansion. Then the character turned to Sebastian. She clarified that the girl was never taken out anywhere or called. The man thought, scratched his head. It seemed to him that the lady had never gone for a walk before. She squatted down in front of Charlotte, took her hands in her hands, wanted her to go with her. She was not a burden and would not interfere. From such words, a tear rolled from the girl's eyes. The heroine persuaded them to enjoy today, the warmth of the sun. And she wanted to come in for dessert. Teacher Rachel was talking about delicious peach pie. The little girl rejoiced. She will go for a walk for the first time and is looking forward to tomorrow morning. A soft blush covered Fiona's cheeks. She closed her eyes, also waited for the next day, and was happy. But the next morning, everything did not go as the heroine had planned. There were 4 of them in the carriage. The atmosphere was tense. No one understood how it happened. Unable to stand it, the 3rd prince cried out, offended that the girl called him a sugarhead. Fiona covered Charlotte's ears so she wouldn't hear the man's screams, while scolding him to keep his expressions to himself. But the guy did not listen to his sister and continued to be indignant, ordering her to speak normally. His cheeks turned red with indignation. The girl interrupted him and began to say her own thing. The prince could not restrain himself. Fiona remembered that Johann was always the victim, the little boy alone, the moonlight filtering into the room. The 1st prince is the son of the empress, the 2nd is the son of the queen, but the girl and the 3rd prince were the children of unknown empresses overseas. The little boy stopped smiling, which he got from the 2nd prince, and at some point he stopped paying attention to his sister. Johann's behavior cannot be abandoned. Disrespect towards her means disrespect for the Northern Sea. They quickly arrived at the square, getting out of the carriage. The sun illuminated their faces, so they had to cover themselves. Fiona smiled, shielding herself from the sun with her palm, cheerful and perky, and clarified where they needed to start. The girl didn't notice how someone called out to her, pulled her sleeve, and took her eyes off the square. It was a girl with short hair. She was holding an envelope in her hands. A beautiful, tall young man asked her to give it to her. Fiona stared at the letter. Johann buried his head in it from behind his shoulder. It was said that he had booked time at the Blue Crystal Boutique. It was worth choosing the best dress. The girl's face darkened. It cost a lot of money. She was worried that the expenses were huge. The attendant cleared his throat. His Highness had prepared something. Would he like to see it? The heroine felt pleased that her husband was taking care of her and looked at the sheet with a sweet smile. And now they were already in this boutique. Having opened the door, they froze with their mouths open. Everything sparkled and shone. In the large, spacious hall, there were mannequins with chic dresses. They were greeted by a nice woman, the owner of the boutique, Madame Nutri, who immediately began to talk flatteringly about the princess. She took Fiona's hand, asked her to take care of her, create the best dresses for her, and Miss Charlotte's ringing voice was heard. The owner poured out like a nightingale. She counted the number of dresses, 10, 20, but the Duchess's hand stopped her, put her on her shoulder. Her face was gloomy. Not noticing anything around, the woman turned around, confident that she had counted a little, but a heavy no hung in the air. Fiona's words made me scream. She was scared because she asked for the money back and would not take anything. Having again entered into her role, the girl pretended to be stupid, saying that it would be strange if she were the only one to shine in expensive dresses, and the officers in old things. This boutique has no competitors, so I sadly thought about not making a return. Therefore, I found another excuse, saying that I didn't want to look better than the officers. Then Madame laughed. Her younger brother sews men's clothes. She might ask him to come up with something. The heroine took advantage of the situation and accepted it as a gift. The owner was surprised, but quickly dealt with it and made a gift. The girls held hands. Now you can safely buy a dress. The 3rd prince was watching them. Something was alarming him. The young man grinned. She will never change, he thought, looking intently at the girl. The prince sat surrounded by girls. His whole life was an endless feast. Love, passion. The prince did not renounce the right to the throne, but without doing anything. In this, all he, Johann, drank wine from a wineglass. The girls fawned over him, but he seemed unapproachable, thoughtful, bringing them closer and pushing them away. Good alcohol that appears with the movement of a finger, delicious desserts. It's nice not to think when you're drunk and just inhale a pleasant feminine aroma. But the reason why he still remains in this duchy is because of the smiling girl Fiona. I remembered how I ran into his room, came to say goodbye to him. I didn't understand what was happening, but the girl's joy was great. A bottle in his hands, circles under his eyes. He did not hear what his sister was saying, believing that she had gone crazy. But the girl assured that she would marry a good man, and there would be someone else in her body. She pressed her forehead to his forehead, asked him to help her sister. The more he pushed Fiona away, the more attached he became. He jumped up from the sofa, shouted, and when asked to extend his hand first and not leave without help, he became irritated. The young man thought about all this, hunched over on the sofa in the boutique. he now gives his consent to his sister. He looked at the girls. Didn't know what kind of help Fiona was asking for, but he would definitely help if needed. All the accompanying people had disappeared somewhere, the heroine wondered. They were walking across the square, she and Charlotte. She bought skewers for the girl, and a gift for Ernst, carried a heavy package in her hand. They needed to go back. Suddenly, a little girl screamed. Something was under her foot. She pointed down, frightened and alarmed. Fiona's face darkened. Charlotte realized that she had stepped on something important. They looked carefully at their feet. It was an invisibility cloak, and underneath it lay a young man with ashen hair on the ground. Rubbing his eyes, he thanked the ladies. If not for them, he would have died of hunger, and introduced himself, Urion. Fiona's eyes widened. She recognized the name. A guess flashed in her eyes. It was a researcher she had not been able to meet. The man turned out to be a vegetarian. He had not eaten for 3 days. He thought of sneaking into the restaurant, but his strength left him and he fell there. Putting her hand to her chest, the girl will provide him with a personal chef who will prepare the dishes. She immediately thought about Ernst. Urian laughed. His horoscope promised him a meeting with the mistress of snakes today, and thanked Her Highness. The guy looked with a slight smile, as if he was looking into the soul, Fiona suddenly thought. She calculated her date of birth, and realized that she was born in the year of the snake. The heroine laughed, hugging Charlotte. The guy is mistaken. She has a different zodiac sign. I was distracted by the appearance of the attendant. He announced that the carriage had arrived. Fiona looked back at her. She easily pushed Urian to the sergeant in the back. He would buy him food and take him home. Climbing into the carriage, the princess looked back at the man. If he was right, then they would meet in the hospital. The men stayed to watch. Urian smiled. Meeting such a man was amazing, he thought. The sergeant disturbed him, finding out where they were going. He folded his hands on his chest. The girl had not yet awakened. She did not know how to use magic. He became interested. The moon illuminated the Duke's mansion. Not all the windows were dark. Not the entire courtyard was immersed in sleep. Ernst was sitting in one of the offices, surrounded by letters. He kept reading them, holding a sheet of paper in his hand, and did not believe in the words. He imagined Gabriella writing a letter, biting the tip of the pen. It was her habit of grasping an elusive thought and not getting lost. The man would never forget his wife until the end of his days. He made such a loud promise. I must write about this short-lived love. My heart hurts from longing for this name. I will never receive an answer, but I can at least leave a letter and flowers on the grave. During the meal, the Duke inquired about the walk. After exchanging pleasantries, the girl inquired about Rachel, froze with a piece of meat. Suddenly, the teacher disappeared. The man pulled himself together and spoke decisively. He needed to say something about her. I wanted to convey Charlotte's upbringing. Miss Rachel was chosen only because she speaks the ancient language. You can choose someone else if the princess is against it. She smiled, put out her finger. She's still poorly informed, so she'll just watch her. She fiddled with her fingers nervously and decided to talk about the dress. It was too expensive. I could use that money to repair something in the mansion. Without raising his head to the girl, he muttered that he didn't want to change anything here. He reminded me of the arrival of Galahad. You can only decorate something for the holiday, but you shouldn't touch anything else. Fiona exhaled sharply. She did not agree with the man. He darkened his face, barely audibly exhaled. As soon as she comes to life, there will be changes. The heroine jumped up from behind the table, rested her hands on the table, raised her voice, unable to restrain herself, because the mansion was already old and would fall apart at this rate. He smiled at the corners of his lips, but his eyes remained sad, and said that this was not bad either. Later, Ernst stood in front of the window, hands in his pockets, back tense, asking his people what the lady had done. The same escort stood up straight and shouted that the girl took almost nothing. Sebastian exhaled loudly, drawing attention to himself, and muttered that the lady was not as stupid as rumors said. The man suggested that maybe she indicated some other boutique, but the sergeant denied it. He knows that Blue Crystal has no rivals. I bent down to finish writing something, and the assistant reminded me that in such situations, they talk about going to another boutique and haggling. The sergeant looked at him strangely, because there were no competitors, and then she would not be able to come to an agreement. Fiona seemed to know something. Since she didn't even stutter about her competitors, the man thought about it. He turned to Sebastian. What would he tell him? Leaned back, crossed his arms. He already understood something. He looked at Ernst. The lady was not as stupid as they said about her. He looked up from his letter, raised his pen, and thought. Moreover, she freely read ancient books. The girl is very smart. Her behavior in the fitting room is proof of this. You wouldn't wish such an enemy on anyone. He turned sharply towards his friend. The princess had not done anything bad yet. There were no evil intentions. She helped find Gabriella's letters. He looked at the Duke with a surprised look. He continued to talk, did not ask the girl for anything for this, but did not. Sebastian believed that the girl should be trusted, but he wouldn't mind watching her. He needed someone who could not only watch, but also protect him if something happened. Kristen rubbed his hands. He was embarrassed to be here, to evaluate the princess. He said carefully that she was beautiful. A girl in an emerald dress twirled in front of a man, asking him whether it fit well. This was very important, because she would be at the ceremony. Fiona also asked about the ankle bracelet, showed him her legs. The exhalation was heavy. The guy was embarrassed. Covering his face with his hand, he refused to look at her, but the girl stubbornly asked him about her appearance and mocked him skillfully. She laughed loudly. The lieutenant became embarrassed, she said, covering her mouth with her hand. She could not calm down from laughing. Christian remembered Gabriella, who also whispered to him about embarrassment and made fun of the young man. The girl pretended to be surprised by Christian's behavior, clarified what was wrong with him, and understood that she was making it clear with hints. He clenched his hand tightly into a fist. There was no need to reassure himself. It couldn't be Gabriella, he calmed himself. The transmigration of souls is only in books. A week later, the princess, sweeping her skirts, ran to the carriage, Ernst walking calmly behind. She was excited that they would finally meet. She was happy. A smile shone on her face. She turned to the man. She was in a good mood, so she laughed and joked, and answered that she was happy to go with her husband in the carriage. She wanted to finally recognize her, asked about her dress, and there was a dry answer from the Duke. The princess exhaled, not impressed by such an answer. She already knew when a man spoke sincerely. Men will not be able to take their eyes off his wife, he said, looking straight into her eyes. His face remained emotionless. But Fiona knew that she was lying when he looked at her admiringly. A blush was on his cheeks, and spoke with a breath about the beauty of the girl. There was little time. He put his hand on the princess's shoulder and told her to get into the carriage. She lightly touched his hand with hers and whispered when he passed by, because he was also a human being. A ship sailed in the perfect blue sea. The waves did not disturb it. It calmly moved towards its pier. Colonel Gaze, putting his hand to his head, cried out, "They will soon be there. Everyone is waiting." The Admiral of the Navy agreed without a hint of a smile that today was their arrival in the duchy. The young man was cheerful, looking forward to drinking the wine that had been taken from the pirate ships. "We didn't think that there would be wine on the ship, especially since there was a wedding recently. It would make an excellent gift." Gaze was a little worried about the young man. He didn't like the power of the day. What if he attacked the lady? The young man shared. Hanging his head down, the Admiral was also worried about these thoughts, and he was afraid of this, hoping that she was a kind person. Some time ago, Fiona was looking through the lists and saw that the man took both his son and grandson with him. She said this rather difficultly with a smile. But the old man was embarrassed. He said that workers would also be needed there, and his thoughts were about what kind of woman he was working for. Gathering people around her, looking up from the sheets, the princess gives them paid leave, because they worked long and faithfully. People cried out, but Fiona gave well-deserved leave, a day for a year of service, so everything turned out well. You can rest, and the workplace will remain yours. The servants rejoiced. Their faces turned red. They could not expect this. They would serve their mistress all their lives. When the Admiral and Sebastian met, they praised the lady's intelligence, working for paid leave. The man turned to look at the flowers. The girl chose not roses and lilies, but daisies, smartly, because roses would not have withstood the cold. Colonel Annette was outside. He refused to eat or drink at the new lady's event, so he was here alone. There was a greeting, and the Duke and Duchess entered the hall. The girl grabbed the man's hand, but walked confidently. Fiona heard the soldiers' delight at her beauty. She was embarrassed. She was pleased. She squinted her eyes to the side, noticed that Annetta was not in the hall. She became sad, but did not show it. This young man was her best friend. After Gabriella's death, a lot had changed, but she knew that she blamed the forces of the day for the death. She was indignant, calling her friend an idiot, which is why he was not at the banquet. Her husband began to look askance at her. The Admiral approached them, putting his hand to his chest, greeted the lady, and told her his name, Balkan. She sincerely smiled at the man, peering at him. She was not hostile. They made her a priority because the dukedom was a priority. He presented a gift, wine that had been confiscated from the pirates. The girl cried out in surprise. It seemed very strange to her that they had such good wine. Balkan invited them to drink a little wine, and the servant quickly brought a glass of red liquid. Suddenly I felt something strange. My pupils dilated, my heart beat faster. Unbearable pain pierced her whole body. She leaned forward a little. The others noticed that something was wrong with her. The body was burning from the fingertips. Suddenly, Ernst picked her up in his arms. The princess screamed. I was afraid that the girl was having a nervous breakdown again, she began to deny. But a flash of pain forced her to raise her hands to her eyes and clutch herself in the man's arms. She screamed about the attack, could not restrain herself. There was a man sitting in an oak barrel. The heroine did not understand where she was. She ran with her eyes closed. She did not understand what was happening. A man climbed out of the barrel, the same wine confiscated from the pirates, and stole Charlotte, grabbed the girl by the hair. We need to save her. The man held the little miss by the neck with one hand and had a knife in the other hand. When he saw Fiona, he decided to make an exchange. The dress rustled. The princess was walking towards him, but there was fear that if he grabbed them together. He grabbed the Duchess, opened her green eyes, screamed in pain. Splashes of blood flew to the sides. The heroine did not understand what she saw, a dream or the future. She was confused and surprised by such a phenomenon. The blindfold was still on her eyes. It seemed that the girl was returning to the beginning of the dream. It doesn't matter whether it's a mirage or a dream. If she could look into the future and save Charlotte. A bloody stain appeared on Fiona's neck. The only way was found. She exploded in bed and was called out by Saphira, who was standing and holding a basin in her hands. The girl screamed, worried about the lady, said that there was such a commotion outside, and chattered in fear. She jumped out of bed, reached for the dress. The maid tried to stop her, but as usual, the princess repeated that she needed to save Charlotte. Her hand tightly grasped the fountain pen, gave the order to the girl to stay here, and she left. Running out of the room onto the stairs, I saw a battle where soldiers were fighting. The clanking of swords was heard from all sides. Glancing at his blade and seeing the new Duchess in the reflection, the natural question arose as to what she was doing here. The admiral turned his head in her direction, shouted, holding back the onslaught of the enemy, shouted to someone that he could handle it, but he needed to run after the lady. The princess was running and thought that she needed to be followed. That's right, she needed to be saved. The Duchess arrived in time, just at the moment when the thug grabbed her, managed to scream and kick the air. The frightened pirate threatened to kill the girl if everyone did not disperse, and held a knife near her face. The girl and the soldiers froze, wondering how the pirate appeared on the second floor. Someone told His Excellency that Charlotte was in danger. Fiona had already tried everything and nothing worked in the dream then, so she touched her neck and pointed to the shiny necklace. It was a beautiful decoration. She touched it with her fingers. The stones shimmered. She could give it away. The man didn't understand what she was doing. He asked several times what it was until it dawned on him. And the girl put her hand to her cheek and pretended to be a fool, laughed, saying that she was a great duchess. Finally, the pirate realized that the duke's new wife was crazy, and it was true. And the princess distracted the guy as best she could, because then Annette would have a chance. The girl stood confident in her actions. She knew that only the guy had a bow and could help. In the dream, he was already here and was waiting behind the tree. You need to bring the pirate to the window. Then Fiona sat down on the floor, whined like a little girl that her legs hurt and she couldn't walk. Let him come up on his own. Cursing, calling her impudent, he moved towards her. At this time, he kept his sights ready. He needed a little more. Annette pulled the bowstring and was about to release the sharp arrow, beads of sweat rolling down his face from the effort. There was the sound of broken glass and a man's scream. An arrow hit him in the hand, blood sprayed out, and he let go of the girl in surprise. Fiona pulled Charlotte out and screamed for her to be taken away. Everything went by very quickly. The girl fell into the arms of men, safe in fact. The Duchess had long ago made a decision. Between a future where Charlotte would suffer and where she would suffer, the choice was obvious. A wounded pirate appeared behind her, who extended his hand to her. That's all. She calmly accepted her fate. He grabbed her by the hair, pulled her back, and warned her that if she kicked, he would cut her throat. Although the heroine was ready to accept, she was still scared. She closed her eyes and blushed. The request to stop came from a man who walked outwardly calm, but clenched his hands in rage. He confidently said that the pirate boss's ship was captured. He would release the girl and remain alive. But the pirate did not believe it, asked for a boat, but first ordered to throw away the weapon. Otherwise, he would be left without a head. Dropping his sword on the floor, Ernst was ready to fulfill the condition and ordered nothing to be done without his order. The pirate put a knife to Fiona's throat and threatened to kill her, sweat dripping down the girl's red face. Pointing the knife towards the man, he demanded that the Duke approach slowly. She winked and made signs as best she could, feeling the blood on her neck. Ernst hesitated, and the pirate noticed this. And the next second, the heroine raised her hand, stuck the pen into his neck. Blood gushed from the wound. The man screamed. Fiona fell exhausted. Christian jumped up to her, alarmed, constantly asking about her well-being. She was glad that everything went according to plan. She looked back at her husband, exhaled. She saw that the man could not cope with himself. He punches the pirate. Blood was flying in different directions. There were no emotions on the man's face. He was just focused on his goal. Then Fiona screamed that she was almost unharmed. There was no need to do this in front of the child. The example was bad. She begged him to stop. He turned to them. There was blood on his cheek. He shouted that no one understood what his wife had gone through. His blue eyes sparkled in rage. Ernst scolded her, lowered her head. She felt uncomfortable. Tears appeared, but stubbornly did not raise her head, trying to say something. She didn't want to lose consciousness again. She didn't hear her husband's words. Her face darkened. She apologized. She would be more careful. The man stopped short, seeing that something was happening to the Duchess, and called out excitedly. She asked to hug her, her eyes closed. She blurrily saw that Ernst was stretching out his arms to her, running. At the same time, the underground prison of the mansion, Sebastian stood in front of a man who was tied to a chair, bleeding. They admitted their mistake. No matter how much they tortured him, the man remained silent. There were abrasions and scratches on his body. The torture was sophisticated, but apparently he really didn't know who the instigator was. The young gentleman sat on a chair, crossing his legs, and read the report, raised his hand to his face, and concentrated. Surprised by his guess, he exhaled. It was amazing that the pirates did not receive official recognition. They knew exactly the path from the wine warehouse to the chambers, which means they know the arrangement of the mansion. He jumped to his feet. A rat had taken up residence in their house, the man concluded, clenching his hands into fists. Suspicion immediately fell on the third prince, Johann, or someone wanted them to think about him and get rid of him with their own hands. Sebastian was also bleeding, thought about it, raised his hand to his mouth. Suspicion falls on the first prince in this case, and he wants to get rid of his competitor. He looked at Ernst approaching the stairs. The assistant knew that he was heading towards the lady. Already halfway there, the Duke stopped. Without turning around, he told his friend that the search was continuing. He continued to rise, concentrated. 10 years had passed since the last penetration, wondering how the first prince managed to obtain information. Confident that the duchy was united, but someone could have betrayed him. They made a deal, he suggested, raising his finger to his mouth. Perhaps these thugs entered the mansion, pretending to be hard workers. The young people laughed and made fun of each other, stole the plan, and gave it to the boss. With the information received, a deal was already concluded with the first prince, shaking hands and agreeing. Approaching the door, immersed in his thoughts, he stopped when the guard greeted him. The girl never woke up. Entering the room, I saw Charlotte buried in the bed, sitting next to Fiona. The maids bowed. The Duchess, surrounded by flowers, lay motionless. Her sleep was deep. Ernst saw flowers. "This is the third prince," the maid said. "The princess should definitely wake up from the smell of these flowers." The girl was constantly nearby. She blamed herself, covered her face with her hands, cried. If she had not left without permission, none of this would have happened. Ernst's sad eyes focused on the girl. He ordered the girl to be taken away. He would stay here. He called his wife, but the heroine was sleeping. The blush on her cheeks and her measured breathing indicated sound sleep. The man reproached himself. The idiot could not save her twice. When his first wife was dying, he swore that he would never love anyone again, but Fiona attracts his gaze. The Duke tried to avoid the woman, not to think or look. From the very beginning, she should have stayed in the East Wing. I looked out the window. It's time to put things in order. The man muttered, looking forward, nodding to his thoughts in his head. To change everything as the girl wants, so that no traces of the past remain. The mansion was filled with the light of the setting sun, saying goodbye to this day. He put his embarrassed face on the bed, next to the girl's hand, and asked her to finally wake up. Hearing her name, the girl opened her green eyes, stared at something, and was silent. She jumped up sharply from the Duke's lap, didn't understand where she was and what was happening, trying to get up. They were sitting in a green clearing, next to a basket of food. The last thing the heroine remembered was how the Duke ran towards her, screamed, lost consciousness again, scolded herself, and assumed that this was another dream that showed the future. Ernst became alarmed, shielding her from the sun, saw that he was holding her head, and began asking questions about her well-being. She became sad, remembered all his words that he threw at her. But the man took her and sat her on his lap, interrupting the torment. Now they saw each other face to face. The girl buried herself in his shoulder. Her eyes became wet, clutching the fabric of her shirt, and did not want to return. 3 weeks passed. Fiona was still sleeping serenely in her bed. Ernst was still constantly near her. He touched her hand, saying that so much time had passed. It was time to wake up. He buried himself in the bed, bowed his head. His hand was on her hand. Emotions and anxiety covered the man all this time. Suddenly, the heroine sat up in bed. She looked at her husband in surprise, exhaled, and barely audibly pronounced his name. The young man cried out in surprise. The princess woke up, came to her senses, and jumped out of her chair. Fiona's cheeks turned pink. She didn't know how long the Duke had been here, but she could see that he was worried, and he also addressed her by name. She laughed. Apparently they were glad to see her, since you called her by name, covered her mouth with her hand from embarrassment, and decided to check if the restriction had been lifted, since the man's behavior had changed. He saw that the girl was trying to tell him something, stopped, and asked if everything was okay with her. She lowered her head down, hiding her sad eyes. There was still a restriction. It was not known when it would be lifted. She exhaled sharply. Her face darkened. She could not do anything. She was upset about it. Apparently, their meeting after a long separation will not take place today. She smiled, raised her head. The guy sat down on the chair, but did not remove his hand from the bed. The conversation did not go well. Then Fiona asked about the little girl, but the Duke did not want to develop this topic either. He suggested postponing it until she felt better, but the princess was uneasy and became suspicious. 2 days later, she realized that her suspicions were correct. Charlotte would not see her. Saphira confirmed this, awkwardly hiding her eyes. The heroine opened her mouth in surprise at what she heard. The cake she was chewing jumped out of her hands, leaving crumbs on the bed. She screamed, clenching her fists, did not understand, because the girl was nearby while the princess was unconscious. The maid tried to speak quietly, but her voice hit her ears. Her words seemed loud. Because of the guilt that gnawed at the little lady, everyone knows, Saphira continued, that the Duchess sacrificed herself to save her. They are even called the Great Savior. Charlotte shed tears. She considered herself guilty, and the woman did not come to her senses for a week. She was constantly nearby and prayed. Realizing that she was so easily allowed to take the blame upon herself, the girl began to boil. Redness appeared on her face from anger, and she was also left near the bed. Her face darkened. She had many questions for the teacher. How did she allow something like this to happen? In this world, the role of a mentor is very great. It is she who is involved in education, not the nanny. Charlotte would not have blamed herself if Rachel had coped with her responsibilities and explained everything to the lady in time. Several days passed, and Charlotte still did not want to meet. Lying in bed, arms outstretched to the sides, the princess cried because of this. Like a small child, she knocked with her hands. She would have found it herself, but due to bed rest, she couldn't do it. Her muscles had weakened. Hearing a strange sound from the man, the girl jumped up, put her hands out. Ernst grinned. It was quite strange. The man began to deny, but the princess heard, although he tried to convince him that it seemed. Fiona thought, raised her finger to her cheek. Last time he called her by name, and now he smiled. The young gentleman now works in her bedroom. The girl decided to do something with Rachel. She needed to change the teacher. She informed her and agreed with her. Everything is as she wishes. The heroine did not think that Ernst would be so understanding. She chewed the pie, hoped for a speedy recovery so that she could meet Charlotte and eat sweets. Fiona remembered her gift because she bought it on a walk with the girl. Now she could give away the gift, beautifully wrapped in emerald paper, and asked him to come to her. When Ernst approached her and sat down in a chair, the heroine stood up and asked him to close his eyes. Opening his eyes, the guy saw an accessory for clothing. This decoration can be attached to a naval uniform. It is often given by loved ones, a lover, or a family member. He held the box in his hands, and his cheeks turned bright red. Surprised by such a gift, he did not hear the lady's question. He jumped out of the chair, putting the gift on the bed, covered his face with his hand. Fiona was alarmed, worried. She did not understand what was wrong with the man. Without removing his hands from his face, he muttered gratitude and hurried away from her, muttering that everything was fine. Ernst left, and the heroine remained standing. She was curious why he suddenly became so cold. A guest came to her. Apparently the man remembered her Gabriella, and now he was leaving without looking back. But Fiona couldn't be alone. The door opened. A smiling Sebastian walked in and immediately complimented the girl. His Majesty's friend came to find out that the princess was dreaming about the future. He was very interested in it. The lady accepted this calmly. The assistant came to find out the whole truth. He remembered the words that she uttered before fainting. He did not intend to interrogate her, but strength can help the master, he cried, spreading his arms. Fiona laughed. She did not know how to control this power, which she informed the man about. Sebastian grinned. He understood that the lady was not as simple as she seemed. He put pressure on her and began to talk about his love for this place in order to get around doubts. Standing opposite each other, they smiled sweet smiles, but they would use everyone who was useful to the duchy. The girl is lost in thought, while her predictions are uncontrollable, but if she doesn't want to see the future, she immediately returns to reality. I asked the man about the family heirloom if he knew the details, and found information about the snake in the library. She clasped her hands together. Perhaps the girl decided that her abilities were related to this. Sebastian asked the last question about abilities. He was curious why the lady was sure that they were connected with the legends of the mansion. She smiled, put her hand to her lips, tilted her head to the side. She was the first to ask. She wanted to know the man's opinion first. The legend spoke of the right and left sides, the front and the back. This meant time. The only thing that does not age is darkness, so people believe that those who own the Duke's family heirloom will never age. The first prince collected sacred objects throughout the country in order to ascend the throne. If he believed that the relic had such a property, he would definitely have obtained it. And lastly, whoever takes possession of the relic will become the emperor of everything, will be able to unite day and night. It is likely that Fiona's marriage should contribute to obtaining this relic, the girl suggested. Now it was the guy's turn to ask. Towering over her, he asked again the question about the connection and began to wait for an answer. The heroine was wondering if she could hint that she was Gabriella. When she began to see the future, the spell weakened. I decided to try it, turned to the man. He was very suspicious, and he laughed and replied that he was proud of his caution. She laughed loudly, then suspect her only in a positive way, in the most optimistic scenario in which it is impossible to believe. Sebastian was embarrassed and meekly agreed. He would try to think about the girl that way. As he was leaving, the assistant turned to the princess and said that the relic had disappeared 6 years ago and could no longer be found. For others, it was a secret. Left alone, the girl became sad. The relic had disappeared, and she looked ahead with an unseeing gaze. I thought, sat on the bed and thought, scrolled through different options in my head, but in the end, I didn't know what to do. She was brought out of her thoughts by the loud voice of the third prince, who called her and spoke offendedly about her deafness. She screamed, holding a cup of tea in her hands. The liquid splashed out. The young man was angry. After sending so many flowers, such gratitude from her. She smiled. That's whose work it was. Her brother arranged a flower meadow for her, as if it wasn't a bed. Christian came in. He personally brought an invitation to a tea party. Surprised by this action, I was curious where this invitation came from. The invitation was from the guy's grandmother, apparently. She was very surprised by this story about the lady. Although she belongs to the forces of the day, she is the mind of the night, so the grandmother considered it worthy to attend the tea party. Fiona looked at the letter. Although this woman had authority, the content of the letter was arrogant and rude. She smiled. The lady understood that such content would hurt and shake the princess, but she sent it anyway. She held it in her hands, laughed. She was still just as correct. Christian looked at the girl strangely. He bowed his head and announced that the tea party would take place in 2 weeks. But if the princess did not recover and ignored his hint, everything was fine with her. The conversation turned to the lady's well-being, but her age is showing. Her back hurts, the guy said. Suddenly, the heroine remembered the medicine, and she also remembered the magician whom she met after shopping. After that, she and the cook even prepared vegetarian dishes especially for the young man, hoping that he remembered the help. Then he could help her too, find a cure for her back. She stretched out in bed. It was finally time to meet with Ernst, and the girl decided to talk. The dark sky was strewn with small stars. Inhaling the cool night air, the Duke stood on the balcony. Fiona went out onto the balcony, her hair flowing in the wind. Her eyes narrowed, carrying a basket in her hands behind her back. He turned to her, seeing the outstretched basket, and was surprised that there was so much food for him alone. He took the food and began to scold the girl, because she was just sick and her legs hurt. As soon as the man said these words, his legs gave way. He held her. There were really a lot of steps. The lady was trembling. She started to apologize, but strong hands grabbed her waist and pulled her closer to her. He lifted him up and sat him on the balcony. Fiona's legs wrapped around the man, air escaped, and her mouth opened slightly. And at that moment, the girl decided to ask about her. asked her husband to tell about the one whom she could not forget. Ernst doubted, looked at her directly, was afraid to hurt her with his words, but the heroine assured that his words would not offend him. Sad eyes looked to the side, a man whom a man does not want to make a memory of, so that someone would block him, but looking at Fiona, he longs to retract his words. The man wanted to tell her something completely different. The hall in the mansion was destroyed, so it would need to be rebuilt, and asked her to change the house to her taste. He looked down at the girl, asked for an apology for being stupid, smiled, and she could forgive him. The Duke looked at her, and the lady's thoughts were busy with how she could ask for an apology with such a beautiful face, and her shirt was also unbuttoned, exposing her body. When he received the gift, Ernst began to avoid her, avoided her at all dinners, stayed away. That's why I made him sandwiches today. Despite the pain the man was experiencing, I was able to be the first to apologize. She laughed, looked to the side. Of course she forgives him, smiled sweetly, her cheeks turned pink. Taking his hands off her, he wanted to show the girl something else. He was waiting for permission, showing curiosity. It was interesting. The Duke led her to the cliff of a terrible pit. Now they are inside the cave of the turtle house. Fiona asked about this house. She was surprised by such a cute name, but the cave was scary. The name didn't fit. Ernst picked up the girl in his arms, asked her to hold on tight. They began to descend to the very depths. She screamed in fear and grabbed her shoulders tightly. It was scary, but I opened one eye slightly to look around. There was no certainty that they were falling. There was a feeling as if they were frozen in the air. The man explained about the flow of air that helps them descend smoothly. I didn't think there was such a place in the duchy. 6 years ago, the guy didn't tell her about it. Ernst slowly sank to the ground. The skirts of the dress flew up. They arrived, still holding the girl in his arms. He helped her down, supported her from behind. She was very surprised. She couldn't wait to find out how the man found this place. He walked up to the door without turning around. He accidentally said, "He found the cave a year ago, on a rainy spring day. The end of the long winter, and the time when Gabriella died. Memories flew by for both the man and the girl." The princess looked carefully at Ernst, held on as best he could. But did she really suggest that he wanted to die? Not knowing what thoughts were tormenting Fiona, he continued talking about tourism. The butler let slip. Having finally mastered the lock, he opened the door slightly, letting in a bright light. This would be enough for the Duke to throw. Without finishing the sentence, he completely opened the door and showed the gold, thinking that in order to develop tourism, this would be enough. The lady's eyes opened. She screamed. She opened her mouth. It was a real treasure island. There was everything here. Documents for the land, ancient artifacts. The heroine now understood where the money for such an expensive boutique came from. With this gold, you can create a small kingdom. The present fortune, these treasures, came to Ernst as a result of battles with pirate ships. She approached the man. She didn't understand why he showed her this place. What if it turned out that she was a spy? Without turning around, Ernst knew that she was not a spy, and not only that, he was sure that the rumors about her stupidity were nonsense. She laughed, so she got caught, gave in to him. They didn't really hide it, was the answer to her. This was the first step towards their relationship. The Duke finally opened up, extended his hand. I wanted to meet him again. Fiona was glad to meet her, which she told the man about. Ernst looked and could not take his eyes off her. I kissed the girl's hand, paid her a compliment, was delighted with her intelligence. She blushed. It was nice to hear that. At this time, the man was sitting and writing a letter. He could not offer to meet naturally. One by one, the sheet was crumpled and sent to the trash bin. The magician was impressed by the Duchess. She left a good impression after the meeting and even sent him a cook. And now, a request has been sent to find a cure for his back. Strange feelings overwhelmed Urian. He even thought that he was in love. His cheeks turned red from such thoughts. But first he needed to check the messages. He took out a magic ball and rejoiced. I deleted some messages without opening them, found one that would be suitable for the most beautiful lady. The pen ran over a sheet of paper. A young man walked across the table towards him through the window, scolding him that he had never learned to talk to people. A blond young man with red eyes, Dante, the owner of the magic tower. The guy grabbed Urian by the chest, shook him. He was wondering why he wrote in 2 years. He squinted his eyes to the side. He didn't have the strength to communicate, followed by an answer. He was surprised by this, exclaimed that he was 10 years older than his brother, and reproached him for growing too much. Dante removed his hand. It was enough for him that his little brother was alive, and his father had even appointed a reward for him. But he noticed that the young man was writing a letter to the girl, asked several times about the appearance of the bride, But Yuri was in love with her magic. That's why he wanted to meet her. The brother grinned. It would be nice if they were together and was happy for him. But he grabbed the letters and began to mutter. The young man put his hand on his head, patted him, and still hidden, scolded his younger brother. The man also left through the window, turning around and telling the guy to contact Ingrid via a magic ball. He wants to see each other. Buried in his hands, Yuri thought about what love does to people. Does everyone really lose their head over it? But a new rumor began to spread in the Duke's mansion. Everyone gathered around the princess, who was holding a letter in her hands. The Duchess received a love letter from the magician. The news spread very quickly throughout the house. The girl was clutching a love letter. She was angry. She scolded this boy Urian. He picked up the letter, squeezed it in his hand. He had been sending these letters for a long time. He was upset in his messages that the princess could not find time for him. The magician presented the medicine. It was easy to open it, press it, and say his name. The girl read the next message. His skills were simply excellent since he made such a medicine, and besides, he had a lot of impudence since he could send such letters to a married lady. She didn't understand why a personal meeting was important to him. She clutched the letter tighter and was angry with Yuri. And then the day came when the lady went to have a tea party with Mrs. Belmore, and everyone came out to see her off. Ernst accompanied him to the carriage, wanted to have a good time, hid his feelings, but still the princess noticed. Then she remembered that Gabriella died in a carriage accident. Apparently the man also remembered this moment. As he saw his wife off, he repeated not to follow strangers. It was funny for the girl. She was being taught like a little child. He squinted his eyes to the side, reminded him of a lot of perverts nearby, and he also heard rumors about Yuri. Fiona laughed. For her sake, Ernst tried on the role of a jealous hubby to show everyone that their relationship was developing. Already sitting in the carriage, the princess reassured the man. She saw the prediction and already knows everything. She laughed wildly and reassured Ernst that nothing would happen to the carriage. She would live, she assured him. The man was embarrassed. There was an awkwardness between them. Fiona had to be careful. Suddenly raising her head, the princess saw the girl and her teacher. She approached shyly and wished her a happy journey. With her head down, Charlotte was still depressed. The heroine even envied such perseverance. The girl climbed into the carriage with the princess, still did not raise her head, fiddling with the fabric of her dress with her hands. The girl waved her hand, was happy. Now she would have a chance to talk with the little lady. She hoped that they would become closer. The princess wanted to share her secret with Charlotte, but the girl tried not to look at her. But Fiona still smiled, in fact, when the pirates entered the mansion. She already knew about it, because she saw the future in a dream. Even if this doesn't happen every night. But then everything was clear. She thinks that it was all to save little miss. If she is in danger again, she will definitely save her again. Charlotte clenched her hands in her lap. The child did not understand why her mistress was so kind to her. She sat closer to her, extended her hand and touched her cheek. The girl meant a lot to her. She did not forget about the warm scarf and smile when she needed care. The most important reason is love. Love for this little lady. Hugged her tightly, pressing her to her chest, because the girl became a member of her family. But if the princess ends up in danger instead of Charlotte, then don't worry, it's all planned. I tried to hide my scar on my neck. Under no circumstances should I show it to the girl. She wiped away Charlotte's tears, which were dripping from her eyes in large drops, but the girl was glad that she was able to calm her down. Ernst was reading important documents at this time, but his thoughts were about Fiona, remembering their conversation, trying to understand how she found out about Gabriella's death. Sebastian, hearing the guy's reasoning, cried out, "She knows too much," but the Duke was not sure. The man's hand shook. He asked his friend if he believed that the soul could move into the body of another person. The assistant formulated the Duke's thoughts more clearly. Lady Gabriella's soul moved into Fiona's body. He rested his hand on his cheek. Sebastian couldn't be sure, but the world has not yet been explored. This can and will happen. He lowered his eyes, suggested asking the magician. The man asked again, "You just need to find one." Ernst immediately remembered about one person. There is one in the duchy who constantly flirts with Fiona. The man darkened his face, moving the stack from one place to another. He did not want to talk with this magician about the princess. He leaned back on his chair, closed his eyes. He could not concentrate on business, because his thoughts were completely taken over by the lady. He jumped up. He didn't like it all. Taking the cloak he would follow. It would be better to be there on the way back. He didn't like Fiona, but he valued her. The heroine and Charlotte were in the water. The girl held the girl tightly so that she would not drown. What should they do? Because the current is carried away, the princess cried out, trying to hold both herself and the child. The heroine wondered how this happened, because everything was fine. They arrived for a tea party. But when they were riding on a boat, it capsized. The people in the clearing were moving away more and more. Panic gripped Fiona. Fear took possession of her. Charlotte raised her eyes to the girl. Tears obscured her gaze. She was scared and asked the girl with hope, because they would be saved. She smiled at her, tried to contain her high spirits. "Everything will be fine," she reassured her. She knew with firm confidence that she would save the girl and would not die herself. Under no circumstances would she give such pleasure to the teacher. 2 hours ago, everything was fine at the estate. The princess was greeted by the lady and her court. The woman greeted the young duchess, bowed her head slightly, leaned on her cane, wrinkles gathered on her face, but a restrained smile appeared. Formal clothing is not in fashion, as before. The heroine finished her observations very restrained and economical. The lady smiled. The smile was sincere. She heard about the merits and virtues of the lady. She would like to learn this. "I decided to behave nicely with the woman, like a grandmother with her granddaughter, of course. Many will think that the girl wants to increase her status in her eyes," she thought. But this was not so. In fact, Fiona was glad to see everyone. The mistress brought her out of her thoughts, coughed into her fist, and asked her to follow her. They walked to the water, saw skillful boats. The ships of Belmore were proud, the lady explained. Charlotte, seeing the boats, opened her mouth and cried out joyfully. "You can see the underwater world through the transparent bottom." Lady Belmore said sadly that at her age she would no longer experience this pleasure. Embarrassed, Charlotte said that she, like the mistress, suffers from motion sickness. The woman remembered the teacher, praised her. The girl had very good behavior. Rachel blushed. The lady's words were pleasant. She ran up to the old woman, grabbed her hand, pressed her, and smiled very sweetly. She was glad that she was remembered. Fiona didn't like this and smirked and took advantage of Rachel's situation to show off. The princess had a higher status than the teacher, but she was so easily removed from the conversation, the girl became gloomier. The mistress kept testing her. "I took a couple of steps with new shoes. There are many ways to maintain dignity without changing the topic of conversation." Making a sweet face, the girl made a speech that Charlotte was well versed in ancient languages, all thanks to Rachel's efforts. The teacher's eyes widened. She scolded the princess in her head, wondering how she knew about languages. Then she did not miss the opportunity to clarify the princess's knowledge of ancient languages, hoping that the answer would please her. She bit her finger, was upset by the girl's answer. She thought she would appear in a better light, but it didn't work out. Terrible thoughts came to the teacher, but she was interrupted from her thoughts when she heard the Yolbor language. The princess easily answered questions in this strange language. Everything worked out for her. Free communication. Rachel was surprised by this, did not understand what was happening. The Duchess did this on purpose, the girl thought, switched to an unknown language and cleverly excluded her from the conversation. But Rachel was angry and would not leave it so easily. The heroine heard that preparations for the boat games were completed and that they could take their places. The teacher put her hand to her chest. "She will sit next to Charlotte because she needs her." She turned to the woman. She saw that Fiona was also heading with them, laughed, and asked in surprise that she would sit with them. And so the boat sails from the shore. A man steers at the bow. The girls sit under a sun cape. Rachel thought something was wrong. They were in the same boat, but she couldn't bring herself to do what she wanted. "I saw a whirlpool and thought that it would easily overturn the boat, and then the stupid Duchess would fall into the water in front of everyone." She raised her finger to her mouth, looked at the girl with a dark gaze, building an insidious plan for revenge in her head, because the princess of the powers of the day should not be able to swim, so she herself would save Charlotte instead of this helpless idiot. She grinned. Then she would become the center of attention, and not this stupid thing. She grinned at the corners of her lips. The heroine had no idea about the teacher's thoughts and laughed merrily with the mistress. Hearing something behind her, the princess turned around, screamed, and saw that they were skidding. "I saw Rachel waving her arms and falling. She screamed loudly. It was unexpected. Everything happened quickly." The boat overturned. Screams were heard. The teacher was still trying to hold on to the edges of the boat. It was necessary to save the lady. Charlotte fell into the water, choking, tried to save herself, but could not. The girl was drowning. Rachel swam up to her, grabbed her by the shoulders, tried to keep her afloat, inquired about her well-being, but there was a smile on her face. She bowed her face closer, smiling, and said, "There is nothing to be afraid of. The teacher will definitely save her." But the whirlpool had already captured the girl. Rachel's face darkened. She didn't have enough strength to save herself. Charlotte quietly screamed. The little lady was already completely underwater. The girl was not herself. Let her stay a little more underwater. She thought how the lady's servants would be nearby. Only then would she save her. Fiona turned her head, looking for the girl, saw that the mistress had been helped, but Charlotte was nowhere to be found. Finally, I saw the child, and the way Rachel was holding her under the water, her face changed, some kind of obsession appeared. Fiona dived under the water, trying to get the girl who was already going to the bottom. Darkness enveloped them. It was scary. She emerged, holding the girl on the elbow of her arm, took a breath, cleared her throat. Charlotte grabbed the sleeve of her dress and did not raise her head. The Duchess screamed and showed interest in the child's well-being, but when she heard from her that everything was fine, she calmed down. They needed to get out quickly before they were sucked into the whirlpool, but the girl was exhausted. Raising her eyes, the girl exclaimed. In front of her was a stone island. It was close to it. She must try to get to it. They were able to get to land. The girl was sitting on the rocks. Fiona was trying to catch her breath. Too much energy had been spent. We looked around. The fishermen were resting here. When it got dark, it seemed to the princess that they had been here recently. She breathed out a sigh of relief. They stayed here for the night. The girl made a fire, and now sat, looking at him with sad eyes, while the girl slept, covered with a cloak. Charlotte got up and began to blame herself, saying that it was all because of her because of the curse. The heroine turned around, grabbed the girl's shoulders, did not understand what she was saying, where such thoughts came from in her head, who inspired them. That's what the teacher said, and mother and father died because of Charlotte. She must listen to Rachel. That's what she was ordered to do. She punished her not to talk to the master, otherwise he would be cursed. The branch in Fiona's hands crunched. She squeezed it with such force, anger boiled and raged in her. She pretended to help, but she herself dripped on the child's brain, using the curse as an excuse. The girl did not understand how she could do this to a small child. She turned to the girl, who continued to sleep. She couldn't understand how Rachel could be so angry. The princess asked forgiveness several times from the sleeping woman. Suddenly, she was engulfed in a glow. Stripes of light swirled around. She heard the sound of a clock, looked at the cave, beckoned and called the girl inside. The Duchess decided to find out what was there, came closer, and saw a stone wall. Awareness clouded her. It was a stele with ancient writings. Fiona was surprised. She did not expect to see such a thing here. The girl read, "You need to go back to the beginning, at a time when it didn't exist. Stop at the moment when it wasn't there. Don't ask for an offering of more than 300 bowls of rice. Blood is the pledge of your promise," Fiona read to the end. Her eyes widened. She heard a loud scream. Her name was called. The princess turned around sharply. Her pink hair flew up. The Duke stood in front of her. He looked worried. Beads of sweat were rolling down his cheeks. Or maybe they were tears. A blush appeared on his cheeks. He clenched his teeth. His raised hand remained in the air. The man was silent. The voices of assistants were heard outside, notifying Ernst that Milady was not outside. The man shouted, giving the order that they should not dare to go inside. Otherwise, they would face punishment for disobedience. The princess screamed. Her wet clothes were visible, and her body was visible. She wrapped her arms around herself, lowering her head. She took off her jacket, threw it over the girl's shoulders, straightened it, and barely audibly uttered her apologies. Coming out of the cave, he picked up the little lady in his arms. He needed to go back to the beach. Fiona looked with a sad look. She looked at her husband leaving. She was scared, but she held on for the sake of the girl. She didn't understand the man's cold attitude towards her now. There was no need for such hatred. Rachel jumped up and began to show concern, making excuses that she wanted to help Charlotte, but was a bad swimmer. And now she was very glad that the child had been found. Although there was a smile on the girl's face, her eyes betrayed anger. She didn't understand how they managed to survive. Initially, Rachel hoped, with the help of the girl, to become a savior in the eyes of others. But then, the flow of water intensified. She alone was barely able to swim ashore when the stupid Duchess went to save Charlotte. The miss hoped that they would not swim out. Listening to all this, Fiona darkened. She knew the truth, and now she did not believe a single word of the teacher. She came closer and slapped Rachel on the cheek, shouting her name. The slap was loud. She grabbed her red cheek with her hand and screamed what she was doing. But the princess got ahead of her and asked a question that shocked those present. She hit her again. Not only did she drown her pupil, but she also convinced her that she was cursed and was to blame for everything. She pronounced a verdict. From now on, Rachel has nothing to do with Charlotte. She must also try not to get noticed. The Duchess was very angry. She continued to shout at the teacher. She had no right to work with children. How dare she say that the girl's parents died because of the curse? Rachel pressed her hand to her chest. She shouted indignantly that it was all a lie. The liar Charlotte had made it all up. As soon as I uttered these words, I fell silent, realized that I had gone too far, heard Ernst's voice, and asked again what I had just said. The man darkened. The Count and Countess died with honor and dignity. What did she dare to tell their daughter? The Duke handed the girl over to his assistant, carefully and carefully. Rachel was frightened and tried to justify herself. The girl cried out. She had taught the child for so many years. She had earned trust. Her cheeks turned red from the scream. Her big eyes looked offensive. Darker than the clouds, the young gentleman resolutely said about the trial, "Then the court will make the decision." He stepped on her. If his wife's words are true, she better confess now, or she will have to pay for daring to insult not only Charlotte, but also her parents. He shouted, pointing his hand at the girl to grab her. The man was very angry. He was hurt by all the words spoken. The young people grabbed Rachel by the elbows. She struggled and did not want to go with them, asking to be let go. She shouted after the Duke that she had done nothing, that she was not guilty, but no one was listening to her. As a result, they stayed in the Belmore yard to spend the night. The character looked sad. She leaned back on the bed, hugging the pillow. There was nothing wrong with not returning home today. She was only worried about Ernst. After all, he left so quickly, the heroine thought, that they became close. But the distance between them increased, which made her sad. So many problems await her ahead, but the girl screamed and remembered the stele with the ancient letter. She jumped up on the bed, sat down on the edge, forgot about such an important thing. She needed to deal with it. But rice was mentioned there, so everyone will remember the folktale and its blind character. Information about Ingrid and a method of treating night sickness are probably hidden here. We need to go back to the time when the disease did not exist. Fiona was delighted. She managed to solve its riddle. When she was still Gabriella, she was looking for something that could replace the bright grass. Although the drops squeezed out of it only slowed down the course of the disease, and it was impossible to restore vision after its loss. But if it is possible to turn back time, back when the light was shining in the eyes, then perhaps vision will return. Everything can be corrected. According to the last line, the solution is already close. The Duke has a relic that was loved by the sea goddess. This relic can help with treatment. She squeezed the pillow tighter, closed her eyes. She needed to collect her thoughts and tell Ernst everything. She didn't want to act stupidly like Gabi. The appearance of a man with 2 glasses and a bottle of wine surprised the young lady. She remembered how she asked Saphira for something strong, and apparently he brought it instead. The delighted girl nodded her head. It was good that he came. She wanted to discuss something with him. The two of them were on the terrace, sitting at the table. The wine had already been poured into glasses. The air caressed their faces. The girl was embarrassed. Ernst spoke first, ran his finger over the glass. Rachel received what she deserved, 8 years for putting Charlotte in danger by pretending that she couldn't swim. For the terrible words with which she poisoned the girl, the sentence increased to 10 years. Fiona listened carefully. There will also be an additional sentence for desecration of the dead. The lady laughed. An ideal solution. A man wanted to ask his wife how she managed to save the child. She was able to light a fire and build a fire, where she learned to make a distress signal. They also covered the girl to prevent hyperthermia, where they found a blanket on a deserted island. Where could it even have been? Ernst wondered, asking his wife. Although Fiona belongs to the forces of the day, she is an excellent swimmer and can do things that they should not be able to do. The man looked at her carefully. Maybe this is because of the gift of foresight. The surprised lady in the wineglass was reflected. She didn't have a prediction, she answered simply. She tried to tell, because she didn't have time to hesitate in such a situation. Charlotte could die. He squeezed his hand on the table. Fiona didn't mean anything bad. She knew and understood that, but she still didn't like it. He raised his voice at the girl. Why was she so careless? The man was angry, as if they had already died once. The parallel was drawn again. This train of thought was familiar to him, Gabriella, whom he always misses. He raised his head and asked directly, she, Gabi, his wife, should finally find out the truth. He demanded an answer right now. Let him say that she was Gabriella. They were sitting opposite each other. Narrowed eyes, a blush appeared, a tense back, waiting for an answer, but did not rush her. She lowered her head. Ernst finally recognized her, but she could not help but utter a word and shake her head, cursed to herself, blaming the shackles. The man got angry, clenched his fist, screamed, did not understand why she was silent, because there was so much evidence around. He demanded an answer from the princess. But the girl couldn't tell who she was. These damn shackles didn't allow her. Only her face turned red from trying to tell. A heavy exhalation came from the guy. He looked somewhere without seeing and began to rise. He left. The princess must have been tired, lowered her head, did not raise it. The man clenched his hands into fists and apologized for showing himself in such a terrible way. They just reminded him of Gabriella. He smiled, changing the body, of course. This is impossible, as if he had said it to himself. Ernst left, leaving the girl alone. She jumped up. Now she understood that she would not look for a wife in her. She felt that they began to move away. I looked at the closed doors, would return to that image of Gabriella. The realization made me sad. After a few months, it became very hot outside, as if real summer had arrived. Soon there was going to be an event organized by Fiona, a festival of masks. The maids rejoiced at this and praised the mistress. Organizing a festival for ordinary people was a great idea, hands on hand. They rely on her from now on. They were happy and considered Fiona the best, but her eyes were sad. The girls whispered. They realized that things were still cold between the princess and the master, and they were upset. After they stopped communicating, their mistress began to look into emptiness for a long time. Her gaze seemed to go out, but she was trying not to show it. After saving Charlotte, a rumor spread among the servants that the girl was under the protection of the sea goddess. Sophia was very worried about her. Fiona turned around, stopping the whispering of the maids, and clarified about the letter to the first prince that they were sending to each other. She smiled. We need to try to do it well, I trusted the girl, because I saw what a bright person she was. If the girl does this well, the princess will be delighted and will give her a dress with jewels for the festival, Sophia cried. She clenched her fists and shook them. She would try very hard was the answer. The girl smiled gratefully. I looked out the window. It was already summer. How quickly time flew by. I couldn't even believe it. One season gave way to another since she and Ernst stopped communicating. She had a great desire to lighten her burden, but in Fiona's body it is difficult to find someone with whom she can be frank. Only Sophia and Christina were with her. Only they were always there. The guy was like a shadow, constantly following the girl. I turned to the guys. Mortal boredom. Now you will hear something interesting. There was one couple. They started a story, who entered into an agreement, a marriage of convenience. But the husband always treated me very well. Wherever she was, he always remembered his wife and constantly brought flowers. Everyone admired their couple. The man was so caring that he even helped her put on her shoes. The girls exclaimed in surprise, amazed at how much one could love like that. Fiona stopped at her story and nodded. It was love, that's right. She smiled bitterly. She didn't understand it then. Christian raised his head and looked at her carefully. The maids shouted what happened next, impatiently demanding the continuation of this wonderful story. The man lost his memory. He became cold towards his wife. He was no longer attentive to her, and the bedroom was no longer filled with the scent of the flowers that he used to send. Fiona answered frankly. Before, the husband did everything for his wife. But because of her political views, the girl could not trust him. She glanced out the window. There were many memories of the man's love that she received. They filled her heart, making her beat more and more often. Now she needs to meet her husband halfway. Now the guy understands how difficult it was for him to meet her halfway. Now she saw it. The maid cried out that no matter how you look at it, it was not hard or unpleasant for her husband. She smiled and did not suspect that this story was about her mistress. She raised her finger up and pointed, because this is how love is manifested. Then the other person will definitely understand it. If she were in the man's place, she would also give all her love. Closing her eyes in embarrassment, a blush appeared on her cheeks. Fiona laughed into her fist. She knows that loving is not so scary, loving alone. She was grateful to the maid for her words. It's enough to just love, she understood. She took a step forward. Now she's pushing her away, but she'll try to get closer. She headed to the door without turning around and announced that she needed to go to Ernst's room. Christian tried to stop the girl, extended his hand. Her story was so familiar where I heard it. She turned around. Her smile was wide. She didn't remember. Perhaps she heard it somewhere, or, having experienced it herself, she answered easily. Christian was confused, asked again. It turns out that she was Gabriella, he said, and didn't believe it himself. The girl came to Ernst's office to discuss the Stele, which she had not had the opportunity to talk about before, but who knew that he was not there today? Sebastian appeared nearby. The gentleman was not there, but if you need something, he can help. Fiona put her hand on the table. Now she will need him too. She can talk to him about the Stele. When the man began to say that the Duke's relic was missing, the girl grinned. She didn't look like a fool. After the death of his ex-wife Gabriella, Sebastian stopped his friend from cremation and insisted on a funeral. He was surprised that the woman had an interesting logic. Don't worry that the first prince doesn't know about this. No one knew that before the girl's death, someone took her ring. Sebastian looked with a heavy gaze. His eyes were hidden by glasses, but a flash of understanding flashed through. In any case, it was cremated, Fiona continued. But since it is a sacred thing, it cannot just burn, so it is somewhere safe and sound somewhere. The man raised his hand and adjusted his glasses. He didn't lie, that the relic was lost, disappeared. It was the truth. Or it was a fake and burned in the fire. The guy suggested this. He thought about it himself. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked again. It couldn't be that the ring had been transferred with her, and she really had lost it. Fiona looked scared. She couldn't believe it, that she had lost it so easily. How did this happen? She closed her eyes and thought that Sebastian didn't tell the truth because of mistrust. But apparently the ring really was missing. Since the relic is missing, what to do with the stele? She exhaled sharply. Since her husband is not here, she decided to talk to his assistant. I asked for a pen and paper. After a while an image appeared. I need to learn a lot about this stele. He grabbed the papers, brought them closer to his eyes, read them carefully. The girl was waiting, leaning on the table. He raised his eyes, smiled, offered to ask the magician for help, and winked at her slyly. There is only one magician who is in the duchy, and it was Urian, the same one who sent love messages. Anyway, the princess wanted to visit the hospital, which specializes in the treatment of night sickness. The man laughed. Everyone in the room remembered the love letters. It would be nice to visit there with the gentleman, Sebastian reminded. A risky idea, to go to the man who sent her letters along with her husband. I doubted that even if she received a real love message, he would not care about it. Meeting Urian is a great idea. The girl is interested in everything. Most of all his older brother, the genius Dante, the owner of the magic tower. A possible acquaintance with him beckoned. If you enlist his support, the problems the heroine faces can be easily solved. She smiled, pleased with her thoughts. She would definitely talk to Ernst. In the evening of the same day, the Duke, all wet with sweat, fought with swords, a voice wondering if he had made peace with the princess yet. Without being distracted from attack and defense, he fought, immersed in his sad thoughts. Sebastian sat on a chair and watched the battle, exhaled air, did not understand why he was here now. The lady was just in his bedroom, the man said. He doesn't know what happened, but it's better to make peace quickly. Everyone sees that a cat ran between them. Ernst muttered that it was rude to the princess. The assistant asked incomprehensibly. See Gabriella in her, came the answer. The Duke stopped and shook his head. He loves his wife too much. He can't forget the girl, and it's better for Fiona to direct her feelings to someone else, he said. It's sad to realize that the gentleman will not be able to love anyone else. His dark eyes flashed. He looked at his sitting friend. Since when did he patronize Fiona? He doesn't understand where he missed it. Sebastian smiled. He saw that he didn't like it. The Duke turned away and headed towards the exit, throwing a sharp no. His friend jumped up and followed him with his eyes. But it was time, and they would see each other later. The more Sebastian talked with the lady, the more suspicions there were. Not everything was clear about the ring either. She knew what Gabriella had swallowed. She also knew about the death of Ernst's wife, about the accident, although these things were known only to the highest-ranking officials, and she knew anyway. She spoke about the funeral with such confidence, with such fervor. Only he knew about the contents of the letter written by the Duchess. There was only one answer. Mrs. Fiona is actually Gabriella, the man finally guessed. I was tormented by doubts that the transmigration of souls is impossible, but this becomes the only explanation for her behavior. She is smart and not at all stupid, as rumors said about her. And the success of her affairs proves that she has already been to the duchy, which means the lady is definitely Gabriella. Sebastian reasoned long and fruitfully. As a result, there is no point in being wary or suspicious of the princess, because this is their chance to get rid of the first prince. Morning came, quite quickly for Ernst. He wanted to walk a little, but in the end he did not sleep all night. A bird caught his attention. The owl was flying straight at the Duke. There was something on its neck. The owl sat on the man's sleeve. There was a red scarf around his neck, which meant an urgent letter from Gain. The letter said that the person who approached the pirates was not the first prince. The criminal was the second prince, William. The target was Fiona. He squeezed the letter forcefully. Apparently, he suggested, the second prince really wants to die. The man was indignant. Ernst swore that if they killed the first prince, then Wilhelm would easily ascend the throne. But everything changed when he chose Fiona as his target. Now the second prince will have to be removed as well. In general, it would be nice, he reasoned, if the throne went to the third prince, Johann. He doesn't want to harm the princess. Ernst's original plan was to disrupt the ceremony of the first prince and raise military detachments. But since the second prince showed himself in such a way, it will be necessary to incite enmity between the brothers. There was a need to distance himself even more from Fiona if the Duke entered into a fight for the throne, because if they found out that she had become a person dear to him, the hunt would open for the lady. He narrowed his eyes, remembered Gabriella's death. He should have done this right away, the man thought. He couldn't push the princess away, but he couldn't forget his ex-wife either. Ernst was upset. I was just wasting my time stupidly. If I asked if I could forget Gabriella, I brushed off my own such thoughts. She was everything to him. It was always just her. He remembered how she offered him a contract marriage, smiling, extending her hand. Gabriella presented herself perfectly, helped people understand and accept her. She always turned out to be right. The man was carried away with warmth by the memories. The girl considered Ernst kind and brave, the defender of this land. She saw only the good, and he tried to live up to it. After such a difficult loss, the desire to become better disappeared, became obsessed with revenge, and thus fell into a trap. Fiona became exactly the person whom the Duke met when he was on the edge, became his salvation. If Gabriella was the first, then the princess became another first. The guy had such thoughts and reasoning, he had plenty of time to think about it. He even thought that they would become good friends, because she is so sweet and cheerful, until he saw her wet body. The man understood that he had to be careful, but all his thoughts swam. The realization came that they could not be friends. I looked at the rising sun. There was one thought in my head. How could I fall in love so quickly? I quickly managed to melt my heart, just like Gabriella. Ernst walked along the corridor, clenching his hands into fists. The girl walked in the steps of his wife. But while Gabi is in his heart, there is no place for Fiona. But even so, in the presence of the princess, his heart was restless. He entered the room where the one who occupied his thoughts was serenely sleeping. The man made a decision, but could not be sane next to her. He pulled the blanket, covering the lady. Opening her eyes, she saw Ernst in front of her, embarrassed, holding a blanket in his hands to cover him, but froze at her gaze. Rubbing her eyes, the girl asked when he arrived. She waited for a long time, but nothing happened. She even dozed off. His face changed, becoming serious. He was wondering what such an important matter was that could not wait for delay. Joyful asked to go with her to the hospital, find out the results of research on a cure for night sickness, and stared, waiting for an answer. The man immediately remembered the research team, namely the magician who sent Fiona love letters. However, if she has a loved one, she will be happier. The answer was, unfortunately, he had a lot to do, so they wouldn't be able to go together. It was unlikely. It will be better this way, the princess asked again without understanding. Her mouth opened slightly at what she heard. She looked surprised. She received an offer from her husband to find a loved one. The girl asked the guy again, as if she hadn't heard the first time. The Duke uttered the words, "They burned. He doesn't care if she finds a lover." The young man believed that Fiona would be suitable for someone who was not burdened with memories of his ex-wife. Noble, unbroken, ideal. Calling her husband by his full name, she asked if he would regret his words. Covered his eyes with his hand. It was hard to answer. He cleared his throat. "There is no reason to worry. There are many worthy people among the soldiers," Ernst hinted. "If the princess doesn't mind, he can send someone himself," he suggested. And the girl became tense and looked angrily at her husband. Confused, he must let Fiona go, not hold her. He cannot be close when his whole life is tied to revenge. Fiona exploded, called Ernst the biggest idiot. The man will get a divorce as soon as everything is over. Slamming the door, she sat down straight on the floor. Everything was bad, very bad. How could such a thing come to mind about a lover? The princess blushed. I couldn't even get angry, because it wasn't about another woman, but about her past. All I could do was cry. She got upset, stood up. If she gets closer to him, it will only get worse. Now it's not clear what she should do. She screamed, getting up, shouted about her lover loudly so that it could be heard. She will start it, for sure. Christian appeared quietly, seeing the lady on edge, and inquired about her well-being. But when he saw tears in his eyes, he was surprised. Although at first he asked a lot of questions, he immediately stopped short, not understanding what had happened. Taking her into the room, he calmed her down, patting her on the back with his hand, and worried about the girl. Christian assured that the Duke did not mean it seriously, just a bad character. But the princess echoed him. Now this will not stop. The young man went out the door, closed it. They would pretend that nothing had happened, and when Fiona calmed down, she would come out to him. The maids were going to clean up, but they saw a man leaving the princess's room. They froze and exhaled. They whispered, recognized Christian. He was there with someone. But when they saw Fiona, they exhaled sharply and fell silent. And rumors spread throughout the mansion that Major Belmore and the princess were lovers. The servants were whispering at every corner. Sebastian held a letter in his hand that there was a rumor. He laughed, he remembered. Gabriella always looked for Christian when she was sad. Apparently this time the gentleman offended him. Now Ernst's reaction to this rumor was interesting. He looked at him with a question. He didn't show that letter, but laughed, waving an invitation to a masquerade ball. It will be coming soon. He said that the lady was so beautiful that all men's gazes would be hers. But he thought that he was already imagining this. The Duke darkened his face. His hands clenched a sheet of paper. Sebastian suggested assigning Colonel Annette to her. Raising his head, Ernst thought. His friend continued that they were from the same family, so it would be appropriate. He would look after her and be able to be with her everywhere. The gentleman's thoughts were racing. He himself had offered to find a lover, and the ball was just a great chance, Sebastian joked, saying that suddenly someone would get into her room while the girl was changing clothes. There was also a second prince who could harm Fiona, manipulate her, and therefore was in danger, but it was better to be prepared for this. A barely perceptible smile flashed across her lips. This is all being done just for her, so it's a good idea, a friend tried. But her knight Christian needs to be given another job. A valuable cargo needs to be taken to the palace. Just work for him. He will send documents to the first prince about the second, and what the first is doing, slowly the plan comes into action. Enmity between them. The beautiful princess was sitting over a cup of tea. Her eyes were very sad. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Charlotte babbled, joyfully sharing the upcoming event, saying that at the masquerade ball there was a gift for the best couple. Colonel Annette often received this prize for the best men's suit, and the girl continued to share. The child chattered, saying that the colonel was the best, and would only marry someone who was as handsome as him. Fiona sat with an absent look, looking at the table. Charlotte noticed that something was wrong with the princess and asked about her well-being. She was probably a lot worried about the ball. The heroine smiled, turned to her. It was just time for her nap. They were going to rest. The girl sat down on the bench. Charlotte laid her head on the lady's lap, and she, in turn, touched the little miss's hair with her hand. When the baby fell asleep, Johann folded his arms on his chest and ordered him to tell the girl. He was ready to listen. The man knew that Fiona was crying. The question flew at her. It was because of the Duke. He might be angry with him. The girl laughed. She was pleased with her brother's concern, thanked him, and called him in a way the guy didn't like, brother. The next words from the man silenced Fiona, blushing. He found out that she was not his sister. The young man knew the truth, that the real Fiona had disappeared. So the girl sitting in front of him was not his sister. She appeared after. She stared at him. Now the third prince knows that she is not a princess. The hand on the girl's head froze. On the eve of her wedding, she asked to help the heroine. At first he thought it was complete nonsense, but then he realized that everything was true. The girl needs to be happy. Since she and Fiona's body has no right to be sad, an order was received. If the princess knew that another would appear in her body, then it was not fate. Perhaps it was not her fault. The guy continued to try to find out her real name, because she is a former duchess, and the third prince revealed the girl's secret. Colonel Annette stood near the tree. He overheard the conversation between the prince and princess. Now he looked discouraged, not believing what he heard. What does this all mean? I heard the whole conversation, but still didn't understand how this was possible. He came even closer to the lady, who did not dare to raise her eyes to the young man, who was waiting for an answer to his question. He asked the lady to answer, to confirm or deny that the prince's words were true. But the girl was silent, also without raising her head. She could not say that she was Gabriella. She did not deny, but there was no confirmation either. A guess pierced the man. Since he is silent, that means it is so. He cannot say it in words. Then Annette shouted about his wound, which remained after he decided to save the cat, on which hand she asked. The princess smiled and turned her head to the young man, as expected from him, pleased with herself, because the question was a trick one. It was not his arm that was injured, but his left leg, and in fact Annette was saving Christian, not the cat, and received burns to his left leg on the ship, surrounded by pirates. The request was to keep everything a secret, but now I was able to tell. The colonel pressed his hand to his chest. It was definitely Gabriella. Tears flowed down her cheeks. The girl was right. There were unpleasant memories for the guy. Everyone agreed to keep it a secret. The princess could not know about such a secret. He apologized for not being able to recognize the Duchess right away and sat down on one knee, apologizing. He put her thin hand to her forehead. There were big changes, but he wouldn't torment her with questions. It didn't matter in what form the girl returned. The main thing was that she didn't leave her again. The heroine was happy, embarrassed. A tear fell from behind her closed eyes, and they finally recognized her. A voice was heard from the same tree. It was Christian, who was now screaming, who heard everything, was angry that they decided to hide everything from him. He sobbed loudly. Tears flowed from his eyes. He couldn't believe that it was true. Lady Gabriella had returned, but he didn't understand. He acted like an idiot. They looked at the man and could not stop his groans, when the girl could no longer stand it and quietly called him by name. And Christian came up and sat down on his knee in front of his beloved mistress. She looked attentively. She asked about the scraps of a handkerchief, raised his shocked face to the princess. He also remembers that. A handkerchief with the lady's initials, red. The guy kept it so carefully that some envious people stole it and burned it in front of his eyes. The girl said all this, leaning towards him, could not raise her eyes, listened to everything, and remembered. There are no restrictions if you formulate the answer correctly. Do not use yourself. The whole scarf did not burn. Only the part with the initials remained. The story continued. He put his hand to his chest. How she knows everything. Tears rolled down his beautiful face. Fiona was surprised when he showed the rag. He wore it close to his heart, screamed, and never parted with the scarf. The men shouted over each other, asked the girl if she remembered this or that, and were embarrassed when she confirmed it. They heard the third prince, turned sharply towards him. He indignantly reprimanded the guys for the way they were behaving. If Fiona had been in her body, they would have behaved disgustingly towards her. He put his hand under his chin, leaned over with a barely noticeable grin, and began to listen. He knew for sure that they would not treat the princess very well, because she is the force of the day. Christian grinned in response. Johann had never considered Fiona a sister, and he didn't understand now why the prince wanted to appear in a good light. A scandal almost broke out, but the heroine touched the guy's sleeve, calmed him down, and didn't want her brother to be treated badly. Moreover, thanks to the prince, the boys recognized her. He was not an enemy, the girl assured her, and asked her to treat her appropriately. She demanded that the guys promise her this, putting their hand to their chest, obeying the order, and looking at each other. Christian asked when the Duchess would tell Ernst and Sebastian. They were very saddened by what happened. The girl looked to the side. They should have found out, but she couldn't tell in person. She couldn't say the reason right now. She was convinced that the Duke would not believe the guys if they told them themselves. He would think that the princess was pretending to be Gabriella. Until she had proof, she could only remain silent. The person who can help figure all this out is a magician. Fiona warned the guys that she needs to meet with the magician. Christian objected in surprise, confirming that it was precisely with the magician who sent love letters to the girl. This is a very dangerously indignant man. That guy looks at the lady like that, Christian muttered displeasedly. Not only did Fiona want to meet him, but also to find out how the research was going. She stroked the boy's hair and calmed him down. It was already getting dark, and the princess and the boys were sitting at the table, eating and drinking. The wine was flowing like a river, and the boys were drunk. Annette said that from tomorrow he would guard the lady. Christian looked with a sad look. He wanted to continue to be Fiona's faithful guard. The gentleman gave the order, and the guy cannot go against it. The second tried to be indignant, but nothing works against the order. Hearing warm words from Annette that he would do his job well and would not lose his girlfriend a second time, I agreed. It was very nice. I calmed down my friend. He was completely intoxicated and was already crying that he wanted to protect her. The heroine laughed, trying to calm the two of them down. She narrowed her eyes. Her friends were nearby. Her soul was light. The men were leaving. They were drunk. Fiona looked sideways at Johann, smiled at her thoughts. Suddenly, she was overcome by pain, burning her whole body, and the girl saw the third prince, who was wearing a crown and calling her, smiling predatorily and dangerously. She didn't hear him calling her. She looked sideways, trying to understand what kind of vision it was. The guy calmed down, raised his hand with a glass to his lips. He didn't think that the Duchess was so important to the boys. If he only knew, he would have said earlier. The heroine did not listen to the guy. Her thoughts were busy with the vision, trying to understand what it was, because in front of her, she sees a boy wandering in the dark. In the future, he will become a very dangerous emperor. The man's gaze from the vision was cunning and waiting for her to come. She was curious why he didn't do anything. Knowing who she was, he could benefit, be it negotiations or blackmail. The prince smiled and was embarrassed, but did not turn his head. That's how he is. He lives at the behest of his heart. The heroine knew that the man had a heart. Wilhelm did not have it. Fiona's memories were still in her. She remembered how she got it from the second prince. Then the third took care of the baby. The little boy blamed himself for not being able to help his sister. The second prince was head and shoulders taller than him. Tears were dripping from his eyes. He asked Fiona for forgiveness, buried himself in bed, taking the girl by the hand, not worthy to be her brother. This was not so. My sister never blamed her brother. She understood everything. Even though she was small, she knew that his helping hand was extended. Johann is a good person. Only a kind person can know about the weakness of another and not put pressure on her at the first opportunity. The girl's words stunned the guy. She took his hands in hers. The Duchess will go to the hospital. The young man can go with her. She looked straight. Her green eyes penetrated inside. Just such a person should become an emperor. Johann recoiled, screamed. How can he get the crown? It's impossible. He opened his eyes in horror. The girl blushed, closed her eyes. There was no need to be categorical. She wanted to build a bridge between him and the magician. Ernst will definitely figure out how to remove the first prince. Many have already had such a desire. It's just a matter of time. She can only push him. But first you need to think about who the people will choose. The girl can help, but you have to decide for yourself. Fiona fell on the bed, felt a little dizzy, drank too much alcohol, and had a headache. The maids who arrived smelled alcohol. The girl felt bad, asked for help to get ready and get some fresh air. I heard that it was better for her not to go out now. She was surprised by such words, and did not understand why she couldn't. Fiona's determination was enviable as she rushed forward to the exit, her servants and friends walking behind her. It all started from the room. The maids saw Colonel Belmore coming out of the mistress's chambers. These girls spread the rumor throughout the mansion that they were having an affair, saw the princess's eyes, and definitely noticed the love for this man in them. And the situation in the evening aggravated all the rumors. When they sat and drank with Christian, the same maids spread even more rumors. I wondered why Sebastian didn't do anything about this. Since the maids themselves tell everything, nothing can be done about it. A guess pierced her, stopped dead in her tracks. This was a test of loyalty, confused her. Why did the man decide to carry out only now? The Duchess understood that Ernst wanted to fight with the first prince. The swords would meet, day and night they would fight. And for this, Fiona looked out the window. It is necessary to strengthen her position as the mistress of the mansion. Only the most faithful people who are indifferent to rumors will be left. Fiona folded her arms across her chest. A butler and a maid stood in front of her, finding out and having a conversation with them. Serious. The girl clarified that they already know who is spreading these rumors about her and Christian. There were no more smiles. They apologized for the inconvenience, but they needed to sort everything out as quickly as possible before Ernst found out. They showed the two who were spreading rumors. For safety reasons, they could not leave them in the mansion. For spreading false rumors and slander, severe punishment is imposed. They need to pay for letters of dismissal, but not give letters of recommendation, sentenced to 10 lashes. This was the order from the lady. Such punishment may seem too harsh, but it is the only way that will help them without ruining their lives. I looked at the report. Ernst can be merciless to those who fall out of favor with him. The servants admired the girl's intelligence. The girl asked Owen to leave them alone with Grandma. They had a different conversation, she said decisively. She ordered the woman to tell everything. She's been too pale lately, so now she will tell everything that happened. A drop of sweat rolled down her cheek. She had to admit earlier, she had problems with her vision. The maid told her in a lifeless voice. She was told that because of her age, the disease was progressing quickly. The girl screamed and put her hand to her mouth. Unable to stand it, the Duchess embraced the old woman, the man who taught her compassion. She felt very sorry and painful. Even she had her share. She will retire, but only after the masquerade ball. They will discuss her salary for the years of service. A decision was made. The grandmother smiled. She still needs to train a new maid. The Duchess looked out the window with a sad look. Seeing off the falling leaves, Grandma Betty had come a long way. How tired she was. She glanced out the window. Ernst was there. She screamed and put her hands to the glass. The man was on a horse, looked back at the mansion, noticed a girl in the window. It was Gabriella, his beloved. He raised his hands to catch her. A smile lit up his face. These two people were once happy. Now, looking at him in the window, placing her hand, the heroine understood that it was very difficult for her without him. Her soul was crying. The next morning, Fiona sat at the table and wrote something on paper. Her concentration was betrayed by her tense back, while it was risky to hire a teacher for Charlotte. The girl raised the pen to her lips. It is also necessary to find teachers for each subject. She brought the letter to her eyes. Thanks to the position of the princess, you can even hire famous artists, and tried to decorate the letters beautifully. My whole body trembled. I stretched, stretching my muscles. I finished. Now I need to send the letters. The Duchess asked Hazel to tell the cooks to prepare desserts without milk. The maid was surprised at this. She smiled. You just need to go and tell them. They will understand everything, something that is easily digested by the stomach. As she walked down the stairs with a stack of letters, her attention was drawn to the crowd of officers milling about in the hall. The girl became curious about what was going on in Ernst's office. The officers were all unmarried. Her face darkened. The realization that her husband had decided to give her a choice of lovers was unpleasant. Ernst looked out the window, sending the most resilient and courageous to an extremely important task. Only volunteers were needed for this. One of the young men raised his hand, tried to do it, let everyone else go, and left James to discuss the details. He turned to the officer, ordered him to follow Christian to the palace and come back. The task was given, the order was accepted. But before leaving, James said that he saw the lady. She had a lot of letters in her hands. The letters were very nice. There were a lot of them. The young man suggested that they were love letters written to the Duke. The gentleman was upset. He lowered his eyes. He wouldn't write to him. It was impossible. I really listened to the advice and was looking for a lover. Despite everything, he still scolded the sergeant for showing too much interest in his wife, waved his hands, and tried to justify himself. Fiona and Annette were getting ready for the trip. Hazel was handing over a basket of provisions and warning them not to forget anything. The third prince called out to Fiona, smiling and waving his hand. He decided to join their trip after all. The man praised her appearance, very beautiful, and getting into the carriage, she thanked her warily. Already in the carriage, the heroine looked at Johann and saw not just a boy, but an emperor with a crown on his head. Looking at the landscape passing by, Fiona was sure that if she attracted the magician to her side, then her brother would be the same as in the vision. The specialized hospital of the Polar Knight was a closed room, located inside the forest. There was a lift that workers pulled from above, lifting people. The wooden body was quite heavy. The third prince saw this. His joy knew no bounds. He screamed. He wanted to know who owned such brilliant ideas. The heroine smiled, embarrassed, thanked the prince. These were all her ideas. They were useful. It's nice that it caused such a reaction from people. They saw the doctor. She smiled, putting her hand to her chest. She greeted Her Highness. She was glad to see. Everyone was working on a cure for night sickness. They didn't look great. The princess hoped that this time they would succeed. When they asked about the magician Urian, the girl hesitated. He was probably still sleeping. She sounded uncertain. She screamed at the guys, who cowered from the scream, to wake up this lazy guy. But there was no need to wake anyone up. The magician was walking, rubbing his eyes. He saw the lady and greeted her. A blush appeared on the girl's cheeks. She was fascinated by the man, considered him handsome, even after waking up. She walked up to him, handed him a basket. It was vegetarian cookies, baked especially for him. The young man was pleased when he took the basket, touched the Duchess's hand and lingered on it. She sharply snatched her hand away and recoiled from him, but the smile was glued to her face. It was all the cook he was cooking. The guy brought his face closer, but the princess ordered, whispering seductively like a tempting serpent. The doctor's face darkened. Lowering her head down, the heroine grinned. Although outwardly he looked harmless, his habits were cunning, like those of a fox. I decided to play with him, so I smiled sweetly, and confirmed that for him, therefore, a man should take time alone. Already in the office, over a cup of tea, they were talking about the study of the drug. The girl wanted to know the results. He raised the sheets of paper into the air. These studies, no matter how many they are carried out, are useless. They will fail. Fiona was unhappy when she heard that it was not a disease, but a curse. Her face darkened, and she took the cup aside. According to the man, all natives of this land are susceptible to night sickness. The only difference is in the time of its appearance. You may be lucky, and it will not manifest itself. There was a question about bright grass, which inhibits the manifestation of the disease, but it has divine power. He exhaled to the side. Fiona also asked about the tears of a unicorn, whether they could help heal, and was eagerly awaiting an answer. Tears of a unicorn, used by Ingrid to save Dante. They can heal everything, the heroine remembered in the original version. If you mix the right tear, which has absorbed sunlight, and the left, which has absorbed moonlight, you will get a legendary medicine. In the original version, Few people knew about the tear of the unicorn, but Dante persistently told the feat of his beloved to all the magicians. The girl read it and knew for sure. The magician Urian could not know about the tears, he thought. It was quite possible that he reacted to the question. The princess cried out when she heard that terminally ill patients can be cured thanks to a unicorn's tear. Since the bright grass blocks, it can cure. The character calmed down, as expected. This is the best part from the original. She understood everything. But these tears are not so easy to get, Urian continued, not paying attention to the girl. They don't even know where unicorns live. The heroine was the person who read the original, so she knew where these animals live, the shining forest. Entering this forest was not so easy. I looked sadly at the tea in my hand. The meeting with the magician was good. I learned a lot about tears. All that was left now was to find out about the existence of time magic in order to save the girl, and whether it could be applied to a patient at the last stage. The guy looked at her. Magic is not omnipotent. Something must be sacrificed, was the answer to the question. Ability mages cannot spend it on their personal items. It requires a huge fee. It should only be used to help others who are suffering. There were also regressors who turned back time, but people who were invisible suffered from this. Many hundreds died. Fiona remembered herself. How did she, after all, also use it to move to another body? Does it apply to her? I asked my guest to the magician whether it was because of such returnees that the people of the duchy were suffering from night sickness. The man was surprised by the new theory, but agreed that it was quite possible that the princess was scared, because even more people could have suffered because of her. He checked his data and announced that, according to estimates, night sickness had increased, even doubled, he said. The girl realized that it was because of her, Gabriella and Ingrid. They were generally very similar. She closed her eyes, really hoped that her movement did not harm anyone else. She was upset. Just like Ingrid, she was looking for a cure for night sickness in order to strengthen her position and save people. She thoughtfully took a sip of the already cooled tea. She would need to resort to the help of Ingrid. She was kind and gentle. She should help. Urian admitted that he was a professor at the academy 2 years ago, but had to leave. Not very pleasant memories of work. I remembered how his students insulted him on the sheets and wrote about a tyrant. The girl was interested to know why she hooked the man so much. He laughed, and of course he responded easily with trembling. She raised her head, listening without breathing. Magic loves her highness, and asked again several times. But because of the cookies, the girls were bribed by these magnificent cookies to answer all the questions. The man tried to explain the time jumps using the example of red dots, asked a question, turned around expecting an answer. You can guess a lot about what a lady might see in the future. This is called foresight. Having heard that she doesn't use magic, I was very surprised by this, because a huge glow emanates from her. Magic is in her. Could introduce her to a man who loves to study magic? With his brother Dante, the heroine cried out in surprise. She took a sip from the cup. She was pleased. It's good that everything was resolved. This is a wonderful decision that she could not foresee. He also surprised her with this news, saying that she was also a person from their lands who knew magic. Johann heard and confirmed that the mother was a foreigner, perhaps from a family of magicians. The third prince shouted that if he was also from this family, then it was necessary to teach him magic, he asked the guy. She clenched her fist. It will be a powerful weapon. It is likely that the first magician emperor will appear. Going outside, the girl realized that it was raining. She needed to return before it was too late. She wondered what to do. She was in no hurry to get into the carriage. The way the girl was dying flashed before her eyes. She was scared, very scared. The rhinestone constricted her throat. Fiona did not expect that she would faint at the sight of the carriage and the rain. The memories were with her. That's why it was scary. Annette sympathized with the lady. Apparently that experience of death got deep into her head. We looked out the window. The rain would not stop soon. Today it would be better to spend the night in the hospital. I thought about my husband, like him, but pushed the thoughts away, because he didn't care and definitely wouldn't worry. And Ernst at that time in his office listened to Sebastian, who showed the ladies proposals for tourism. The assistant was very surprised when he heard the man ask about his wife's birthday. He began to shout indignantly, "How can the husband not know about his wife's birthday? It would be better to ask her personally." Sebastian saw the hand with which he hit the table. The man understood that he was angry and angry. His face darkened when he heard his friend say that women like Fiona no longer exist and should be appreciated. He felt pain from the realization that the girl could leave, even though he did not hold her, but it still hurt. Sebastian was hiding something, grinned, adjusted his glasses, and looked at his friend with a surprised look. Owen explained, coughing into his fist. He was embarrassed to talk about this, but he told the rumors that were circulating in the mansion. That's why she fired so many people, the Duke was pleased. His wife quickly got rid of the rats. The assistant recalled that Fiona was very similar to one wonderful woman who solved matters in the same way. The butler understood the man. Everyone loved Gabriella, but thanks to the princess, many new and good things had changed. I listened to Owen's words, realized what he was doing with his wife, how he was moving away from her, and thought about it. As soon as Ernst thought about apologizing to his mistress, a messenger arrived with the news that the girl felt ill, was frightened by a thunderstorm, and fainted. He was very surprised by this. He was curious why the lady was afraid of thunderstorms, interrupted his voice, and decided to say something else. And Sebastian revealed that the princess knew that Gabriella had swallowed the family heirloom. In this heavy downpour, the rider galloped on a horse. The weather did not stop him. Forward, his cloak fluttered behind him, rushing towards the one he loved with all his heart. Once in the hospital, the man began screaming loudly and calling for Fiona, deafening the silence with his loud voice. Seeing Annette, he headed towards him, stopped and clarified that his wife had fainted, where and how she was. Questions rained down one after another. Fiona was sleeping, opening the door. The lieutenant showed what was wrong with her. In her sleep, she spoke about her pain, that her leg hurt. Tears gathered in the corner of her eyes. Ernst looked at the sleeping woman and wondered why his leg hurt. In this fragile body was his Gabriella. So many times she let him know that she had returned. He touched her hand. Let the dreams not be darkened by nightmares. He was a fool for not noticing attempts to reach him. Opening her eyes, the princess saw Ernst, who was holding him just as tightly, and called him quietly. The man admitted that as soon as he found out what happened to her, he immediately rushed here. The young man tried to apologize for upsetting the girl, but did not want to do it. He clenched his fist and brought it to his chest, swore that this would not happen again. He apologized for all his words and actions, and asked him to become a good husband again. She jumped up in bed. The girl pinched the guy's cheeks, repeating that it was just a dream, but he denied it. Fiona embraced the man. As soon as he said her name, he recognized her. It happened, and he recognized her, as he had been waiting for a long time. Convinced that the princess was his Gabi, he closed his eyes and hugged her tightly, a blush scorching his cheeks. The heroine smiled happily. Even the rain had stopped. There would be a rainbow soon, and she raised her hand to her lips. A few days later, after the confession, in the dining room, a man tried to feed his wife. She was so thin and light, it cost her more to eat. I looked at my husband and didn't understand how a person could rarely change in such a short time, but I was glad about it. Throwing open the door, Sebastian burst into the dining room. He shouted for everyone to mind their own business, shouted angrily, destroying the idol of the couple. The Duke suggested moving the ball earlier, to coincide with Fiona's birthday. The girl asked to go on a date with her there.